She was 9 years old, standing in the middle of four teenage boys twice her size, and she wasn't moving, not an inch. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep them at her sides. But her feet stayed planted on that frozen pavement like she'd grown roots straight through the concrete. The boys circled slowly, voices low and cruel, the way predators get when they've already decided how something ends. Nobody around them moved. A woman pretended to look at her phone. A man in a gray coat crossed to the other side of the street. The world turned its back so quietly you could almost miss it. Then came the thunder, low, distant, getting closer. And Blackridge, Tennessee would never be quite the same again. If this story already has your chest tight, stay with me. Every part of this is going to shake something loose. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and drop in the comments what city you're watching from. Let's ride. The cold arrived early that year in Blackridge. Not the kind of cold that creeps, the kind that drops without warning, turning last week's amber-lit autumn into something harder, sharper, gray at the edges. The oak trees along Millhaven Street still held half their leaves, but they'd gone brittle overnight, and when the wind moved through them, it made a sound like something being crumpled and thrown away. By the second week of October, the diner on Route 9 was already running its heat full blast by noon, and the old men who gathered there every morning had started wearing their heavier coats, the ones that smelled like cedar and basements and seasons they weren't sure they'd see many more of. Elias Mercer was not one of those men, though he was certainly old enough to be. He came to Riverside Park every Tuesday and Thursday at 2:30, rain or shine, or the particular kind of frozen Tennessee overcast that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. He came in his wheelchair, the manual kind, not the electric, because Elias Mercer had strong arms and a stronger refusal to be moved by anything he hadn't decided to move toward. He wore a Vietnam veteran's cap that had seen better decades, a dark green field jacket with the name tape still stitched above the breast pocket, and a particular expression that most people in Blackridge had learned to respect from a distance. Not because he was unfriendly, because he looked like a man who had already had every important conversation worth having, and anything you might bring to him would need to meet a very high standard before he'd bother opening his mouth. He fed the ducks on the pond near the east bench. That was the thing he came for. He kept a small paper bag of torn bread in the side pocket of the wheelchair, and he'd work his way through it slowly over 45 minutes, not talking, not reading, just watching the ducks with the kind of patience that only comes from having waited for things far more important than ducks and circumstances far more dangerous than a park in October. His wife, Vivian, had started the ritual. 17 years ago, before the strokes took her steadiness and his legs, they used to walk here together Sunday afternoons. She'd bring coffee in a thermos, and he'd bring the bread, and they'd stand at the edge of the water without saying much, which was one of the things Elias loved most about Vivian, her complete comfort with silence. After the wheelchair came, she kept walking alongside him. After she developed the tremor in her hands, he started tearing the bread for both of them. Now she stayed home most days, and he came alone. And he tore the bread alone, and the ducks didn't seem to notice or care about any of it, which was also something he loved about ducks. He was reaching into the paper bag when he heard them. 4 of them, 16, 17, wearing that particular costume of teenage viciousness, hoods up, hands in pockets, that loose-limbed walk designed to signal they had nowhere to be and nothing to lose. They came from the North Path, the one that wound past the broken water fountain and the spray-painted picnic tables the Parks Department kept repainting and the kids kept marking up again in an ongoing war. Neither side was willing to quit. Elias had seen boys like this his entire life. He'd been one once, long before Vietnam burned everything soft out of him and replaced it with something harder and quieter and more permanent. He watched them without turning his head, an old reflex, eyes forward, peripheral vision doing the real work. They weren't heading for him. Not at first. She came from the other direction, the South Path, the one that ran along the low fence separating the park from the church parking lot. A small girl, couldn't have been more than 9, wearing a faded crimson coat that was probably a size too big, sleeves coming down past her wrists. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had mostly fallen apart, a backpack that hung too heavy on her left shoulder, and she was walking fast, head down, the way a child walks when she knows she's supposed to be somewhere but hasn't figured out yet that the world doesn't always cooperate with where you're supposed to be. She almost walked straight into them. Almost. She stopped just in time, looked up, and in the half second before the boys rearranged their expressions into something designed to be intimidating, Elias saw her register what she was looking at and make a decision. She didn't run. She took one small step to the left, meaning to go around them, and the tallest one matched the movement. "Hey," he said. Just that. The word a door closing. Elias set down the paper bag. His hands went to the wheels of the chair, but he didn't push yet. He calculated. 72 years old, strong in the arms and the shoulders, useless below the hip. 4 of them, and they hadn't noticed him yet. Or if they had, they'd already dismissed him, which told him something about what they saw when they looked at an old man in a wheelchair by a pond, and something about what they expected to happen next. He was wrong about one thing. She didn't try to go around them again. She stood her ground, which surprised him, and looked at the tallest boy with an expression so stripped of fear it bordered on something else entirely, something almost defiant, and she said, "I need to get through." Not a question, not a plea. A statement of simple fact delivered by a 9-year-old in an oversized coat on a freezing Tuesday afternoon. The tallest boy laughed. The others joined in, that ugly relay laugh, rehearsed and hollow. One of them moved to block the other side. Elias pushed his wheels forward. He didn't hurry. Hurrying told them something he didn't want them to know. He moved steadily, covering the 40 feet of cracked asphalt between the bench and where she stood, and the sound of the wheels and the sound of him were apparently enough, because the boy on the left turned and saw him coming, and something flickered in his face. Not quite respect, but the memory of what respect felt like when it was compulsory. "Something wrong?" Elias said. His voice had the quality of a drawer being pulled open slowly to reveal something heavy inside. The tall one turned, looked at Elias, looked at the wheelchair. Made the calculation most people make when they see someone in a wheelchair. That the chair is the whole story, that it's a sentence as well as a fact, that it tells them everything they need to know about threat assessment. "Just talking," the tall one said. "Didn't look like talking," Elias said. The girl had not moved from her spot. Elias was now beside her, which was what he'd aimed for, not in front of her. He'd thought about that, the full 3 seconds it took him to cross the pavement, and he'd decided against it. In front of her was protection. Beside her was something else. Beside her said she didn't need protecting. It said she was already doing the thing that mattered, and he was just keeping her company while she did it. He wasn't sure a 9-year-old could read that. He wasn't sure it mattered if she could. The boys didn't move immediately. That was the dangerous part. The dangerous part was always the pause before the decision, the moment where it could still go any direction, where some small, stupid piece of adolescent pride might decide that backing down in front of each other was worse than whatever came next. Elias had seen that calculation go wrong in places that made a Tennessee park in October look like paradise, and he felt the familiar stillness settle over him, the one that came not from courage, but from having been afraid so many times in so many worse places that this particular fear felt almost manageable by comparison. The tall boy held his gaze for 4 seconds. Then he looked away, looked at his friends. Something invisible passed between them, some agreement made in the language of boys who weren't ready to be the kind of men they were pretending to be. They moved. Not fast. Fast would have admitted something, but they moved, drifting south along the path, their voices picking back up in the forced, casual way of retreat being dressed up as intention. The park went quiet. The girl stood perfectly still for a moment. Then she turned to look at Elias, and he looked back at her, and she said, with a seriousness that seemed to come from somewhere older than 9, "Thank you." "You were already standing," he said. She considered that. "My hands were shaking." Hands always shake, feet are what matter. She looked down at her feet, back up at him. Then she hitched her backpack higher on her shoulder and walked to the south bench and sat down and took out what appeared to be a small notebook with a red cover and began writing something. Elias watched her for a moment, then turned back to his ducks. He was still watching the water when he heard the motorcycle and shut. Gideon Cross rode a 2003 Harley-Davidson Road King that he'd rebuilt twice from near nothing, and the sound of it was unmistakable in Blackridge. A deep rolling thunder that sat somewhere between a warning and a promise. The kind of engine note that turned heads not because it was obnoxious, but because it was alive in a way that most mechanical things weren't anymore. He'd tuned it himself. as he tuned everything himself. In the back bay of Cross Mechanical on Route 9, a shop that occupied a converted gas station with a hand-painted sign and a parking lot full of machines in various states of becoming. He was not supposed to be in Riverside Park. He was supposed to be replacing a clutch cable on a 1988 Sportster belonging to a man named Dennis Pratt, who needed it done by Thursday and had called twice already today to confirm this. He had the cable in a box on his workbench. He had the tools laid out. He'd been about to start. Then Carla Vess from the diner had called his cell phone and said, in her particular way that admitted no alternative interpretation, "You need to come to Riverside Park right now, Gideon. Elias Mercer's in the middle of something." Carla Vess had known Gideon Cross for 11 years, since the day he'd ridden into Black Ridge with a duffel bag, $3,000 in cash, and a look on his face that she'd later describe as a man arriving at a destination he hadn't planned on. She'd fed him coffee and a plate of eggs and told him about the old gas station for sale on Route 9, and something about the plain way she'd delivered the information made him go look at it. He trusted her instincts the way you trust things that have proven reliable in conditions that counted. He'd arrived on the North Path just in time to see nothing, just Elias by the pond and a girl on the south bench with a notebook. The boys were already gone. The park was quiet in the way parks are quiet when something has just passed through that hasn't settled yet. He killed the engine and walked the bike along the path, which technically wasn't permitted, but which the Parks Department had stopped bothering to enforce after the third time they'd tried to make an issue of it with Gideon, and found him politely, completely unmovable on the subject. He leaned the bike on its kickstand near the lamppost and walked to the pond. Elias heard him coming and didn't turn. "Carla called you," Elias said. "Carla calls me," Gideon said. He stopped beside the wheelchair, looked at the ducks. "She all right?" "The girl?" "Fine. Sat down and started writing in a notebook." A pause. "You know her?" "Maisie Rowan," Gideon said. He said it the way you say a name when you know the whole file that goes with it. "Art teacher's daughter. Mom's been dealing with something I probably shouldn't say. She lives 2 blocks east, comes through the park on her way to wherever she goes after school." Elias was quiet for a moment. "She didn't move." "What?" 4 boys. She had the right of way and she didn't move." He broke off another piece of bread, threw it toward the nearest duck. 9 years old." Gideon said nothing. He looked at Maisie Rowan on the south bench, her red coat bright against the gray afternoon, her head bent over whatever she was writing. He looked at her the way he looked at things that required understanding before he decided what to think about them. Carefully, without rushing, reading the edges first. "What did they do?" he asked. "Nothing. I got there." "You got there. I had a good angle." Elias's voice had the dryness of someone making peace with a limitation by refusing to call it one. Gideon understood this perfectly. He turned to look at Elias for the first time since arriving. Really look, the way 2 people who speak the same language look at each other, taking inventory without commentary. Elias Mercer had a face carved by decades of outdoor light and indoor silence, eyes the color of creek water in November, deep set and level. The field jacket, the name tape, the cap. "Vietnam?" Gideon said. 68 to 70? A beat. "You?" "Iraq. 2 tours, Afghanistan after." Elias turned his head and looked at Gideon directly for the first time. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. A mutual recognition, the specific frequency that only transmits between people who have stood in certain places and cannot unstand them. Not camaraderie exactly. More like the understanding that some things leave marks that don't show on the outside, and in the presence of someone else who knows this, you don't have to spend energy pretending otherwise. "Army," Gideon said. "Marines." Elias turned back to the water. "Semper Fi." "Hoo-ah," Gideon said. And that was the entirety of it. 2 men, 50-plus years of combined service between them, 4 seconds of eye contact, and something established that would have taken civilians an hour of conversation to approximate. They stood and sat in silence for several minutes. The ducks moved across the gray water. The cold air carried the smell of dead leaves and distant exhaust. Somewhere behind them, Maisie Rowan finished whatever she was writing, closed the red notebook, and zipped it back into her coat. When Gideon glanced back at her, she was looking at him, not with the wariness children show strangers, but with the direct, evaluating attention of someone taking measurements. He gave a small nod. She gave one back, precise and formal, and stood, and walked toward the south exit of the park without looking back. He watched until she was gone. "She live alone?" he asked. "Don't know her situation," Elias said. "She's here most days, always walking fast." Gideon filed that away in the particular cabinet where he kept things that deserved more examination when he had time, and turned back to Elias. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and checked the time, then looked at the sky, which was doing its best impression of something about to make a decision it had been putting off all afternoon. "It's getting cold," Gideon said. "You want to ride back?" "I have a van." Elias gestured vaguely toward the north parking lot. "Vivian's nephew drives me." "He here now?" A silence that told Gideon everything. "He was supposed to be here at 3, Elias said. Gideon looked at his phone again. 3:18. He looked at Elias. Elias was looking at the ducks with an expression of serene, practiced patience that Gideon recognized as the specific face a man makes when he has spent decades managing his relationship with other people's failures. "I'll wait with you," Gideon said. "You don't have to do that." "I know." He found a bench. He sat. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the pond and said nothing. And Elias said nothing. And the ducks paddled in their indifferent circles, and the cold pressed in steadily from the north, and the afternoon went gray and grayer around them, while they waited for a man who was not going to come. The van arrived at 4:15, driven by a young man named Travis, who smelled like he'd been somewhere warm and noisy, and didn't appear to experience any particular guilt about this. He got out of the van without apology and opened the back to lower the lift, and Gideon stood and watched him with the particular quality of stillness that Gideon employed when he was deciding not to say something. "He late a lot?" Gideon said to Elias quietly, while Travis fiddled with the lift mechanism. "Define a lot." "More than twice a week." A pause. "He means well," Elias said. Gideon had heard those words in various combinations his whole life, and they had never once been followed by anything reassuring. He watched Travis maneuver the wheelchair onto the lift with the casual carelessness of someone who'd been doing something long enough to stop noticing the human being at the center of it. Elias held himself very straight through all of it, his hands folded in his lap, his face utterly neutral, not asking for anything, not showing anything, present and absent at the same time in the way that people learn to be when they need to get through something with their dignity intact. The van doors closed. Travis didn't acknowledge Gideon. Gideon stood in the parking lot and watched the van until it turned onto Millhaven Street and disappeared. Then he stood there a little longer, not moving, while the parking lot lights buzzed to life around him in the early arriving dusk. His breath made small clouds in the cold. He could feel the temperature dropping on the back of his neck, the exposed skin above his collar, that specific bite that said October was done pretending. He thought about Maisie Rowan and her steady feet and her shaking hands and the red notebook she pulled out as soon as it was over, as if she'd needed to get something down before she lost it. He thought about a 9-year-old standing between 4 boys twice her size and not moving. He thought about Elias Mercer in a park, 2 hours past his pickup time, feeding ducks in a field jacket in the cold, calling it fine. He got on his bike. He didn't ride back to the shop. The Rusty Nail was not the worst bar in Blackridge, but it occupied a comfortable position in the lower tier. A long, narrow room with a bar down one wall and booths down the other, and a jukebox in the back corner that only worked if you kicked it on the left side, which everyone who went there knew, and which served as its own informal membership test. The beer was cold, the lights were low, and on a Tuesday evening in October, it held the specific demographic of people who needed somewhere to be that wasn't home. Gideon sat at the far end of the bar with a coffee. He didn't drink anymore, hadn't for 6 years, and the bartender knew this and kept the pot fresh without being asked. And he worked through what he knew. He knew Elias Mercer's name because everyone in Blackridge knew it in the vague way that small towns know their veterans, present, acknowledged, and mostly forgotten, except on the days set aside to remember them. He knew Elias was 72, that he'd had a stroke 3 years ago that had taken his legs, that he and Vivian lived on Creston Road in the house they'd owned for 40 years. He knew that before the stroke, Elias had spent Tuesday mornings at the VFW Hall on Franklin Street, a routine that apparently continued until the hall had quietly closed for structural reasons 18 months ago, and nobody had gotten around to finding an alternative. He knew that the boys from the park were not from Blackridge proper. He'd recognized 2 of them from Caldwell County, a particular family from out past the county line whose relationship with restraint was historically limited. They'd driven in. They'd come to this park specifically, which meant they'd come here before. He thought about a wheelchair and a field jacket and a man who hadn't said he was in pain, even though the 2-hour wait in the cold had clearly cost him something he wasn't going to name. He pulled out his phone and called Silas Boone. Chime. Silas Boone answered on the second ring the way he answered everything, immediately and without preamble, as if he'd been waiting specifically for this call and didn't want to waste time getting to it. Gideon, you at the chapter house? Where else? It wasn't a question. Need to talk. Come over. I'm at the nail. Give me 30 minutes. He heard Silas set something down, metal on wood, the sound of the chapter house kitchen, where Silas spent most evenings because the man had discovered late in life that cooking was the one activity that required his whole attention and thus the only thing that quieted his head. He was a big man, Silas Boone, 6'2" and built like a man who had been large his whole life and learned early that size was a language and had chosen to speak it quietly. He'd been chapter president of the Iron Covenant for 11 years, a position he'd never sought and accepted only after making it clear to the charter that he would run it his way or not at all. They'd agreed. He'd been as good as his word. The Iron Covenant was not a club that advertised itself. No website, no social media presence beyond what club members maintained personally. Their cuts were black leather with a minimal patch. The name, the chapter, a small iron cross that had been on the original design and that nobody had ever proposed removing because it wasn't the kind of thing you removed. They were known in the regional biker community the way certain people are known, by reputation, by word of mouth, by the accumulative weight of things they'd done and hadn't done over many years. What they didn't do, trafficking, drugs, shakedowns, the various criminal enterprises that gave outlaw clubs their particular reputation. What they did do was considerably harder to categorize, which was the way Silas preferred it. Gideon had been a prospect for 8 months after riding into Blackridge, which was shorter than usual and reflected an assessment that Silas had never explained in words. He'd been a full member for 10 years now, and chapter sergeant-at-arms, a title he neither used nor acknowledged in conversation, but which meant, in practice, that when something needed handling in a way that required both restraint and the credible threat of its absence, Gideon Cross was the call that got made. He finished his coffee, left cash on the bar, and rode to the chapter house. The Iron Covenant chapter house sat at the end of a gravel road off Route 12, a converted farmhouse with a large garage attached and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The land around it had once been a working property. You could still see the outline of what had been a fence line, the ghost of a pasture that had gone back to scrub oak and wild grass. The garage held 8 bikes on any given night and more on weekends. The porch held a collection of weather-beaten furniture that had accumulated over years of people dragging things out to sit in the evening air and then forgetting to bring them back inside. Silas was at the kitchen table with a Dutch oven and an expression of focused concentration when Gideon came in. He didn't look up. Hungry? No. Gideon sat across from him, waited. Silas stirred whatever was in the pot, tasted it, added something from a small jar. Then he set down the spoon and looked up. Talk, he said. Gideon talked. He gave it straight. The park, Maisie Rowan, Elias Mercer, the 4 boys, the 2-hour wait in the cold, the van and the nephew and the field jacket and the Vietnam veteran's cap. He didn't editorialize. He didn't have to. Silas listened the way he always listened, completely still, his large hands flat on the table, eyes on Gideon's face with the full weight of his attention. When Gideon finished, there was a silence. Vietnam, Silas said. 68 to 70? Another silence. Silas picked up the spoon again, looked at it, set it down. The boys. Caldwell County. I know one of the families. They'll be back. Yes. Silas looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. How many can you reach by tomorrow morning? Gideon thought about the question and understood immediately what was being decided. This was not a question about logistics. This was a question about whether a thing was worth doing, and the only answer Silas wanted was a number, because the question of whether it was worth doing had already been settled in the moment Gideon picked up the phone. 40 within the chapter, Gideon said. If we reach out to Iron Falls and the Meridian chapter, maybe another 60. If we go wider, Silas said. Gideon looked at him. He's a Marine, Silas said. He fed ducks for 2 hours in the cold because a kid was late. A pause. Go wider. He made the calls from the parking lot of the Rusty Nail because the acoustics of the cold night air suited him better than any indoor space. He sat on his bike and worked through his phone, voice low and steady, and each conversation was almost identical in structure. The essential facts, the name, the branch of service, the year, what was needed and when. No speeches, no requests for favors, just information offered to people who would decide what to do with it, and who Gideon trusted to decide correctly because 11 years of shared history was a reasonable basis for trust. He called Dale Whitmore in Iron Falls, Ricky Carr in Meridian, Marcus Webb, who ran a loose chapter down in the southern part of the county and whose members had a particular collective feeling about Vietnam veterans that stemmed from a history Marcus had never fully explained but didn't need to. He called Janet Lee, who wasn't a rider but knew every rider within 100 miles, and had a phone list that was the closest thing the regional biker community had to a registry. By the time he finished, it was close to 9 o'clock, and his hands were stiff from the cold, and the parking lot was empty except for his bike and the neon sign of the Rusty Nail throwing red light across the asphalt. He sat for a moment without calling anyone else. The night was very quiet except for the distant sound of a freight truck on Route 9. He could see his breath. He could feel the particular ache in his right shoulder that lived there year-round but chose cold nights to make itself loudly known. A remnant of Kandahar that showed up on his medical records as soft tissue damage, and that Gideon thought of, on bad nights, as the body's way of refusing to let you forget. He thought about what Elias had said. She didn't move. He thought about Maisie Rowan and her red coat and her red notebook and her formal little nod, and the particular quality of courage that doesn't know it's courage yet, the kind that comes out of a child before the world has gotten to them enough to teach them what's prudent. He started the bike. The sound filled the parking lot and then stretched out into the road, and he rode back to the shop where the clutch cable for Dennis Pratt's Sportster was still waiting on the workbench, and where he worked until midnight in the fluorescent light, hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind arranged and rearranged the pieces of the next 24 hours, planning with the quiet precision of a man who had learned long ago that the difference between an intention and an outcome is usually preparation. He didn't sleep much. He never did anymore. But when he finally shut off the lights and sat in the dark of the shop for a few minutes before heading to the apartment upstairs, he was aware of something that wasn't quite peace but was its closest neighbor. The sense of having located the right action in the middle of a great deal of noise and having moved toward it without waiting to be certain. Certainty, in his experience, was a luxury that arrived after the fact, if it arrived at all. He was back at Riverside Park by 7:30 the next morning. Not to do anything specific, just to be there, to walk the paths and check the angles and understand the geography of the place the way he'd been trained to understand geography, not as scenery, but as a set of conditions, some of which could be controlled and some of which could only be accounted for. The park in morning was a different creature than the park in afternoon. Quiet, frost-edged, the pond surface flat and steel-colored under an overcast sky. A woman walked a dog along the north path. A teenage boy with headphones sat on a bench eating from a paper bag. No one else. He walked the south path that Maisie would have come from. He noted the sight lines, the bench Elias used, the distance between the pond and the south entrance. He walked out to the south entrance and looked at the sidewalk, at the 2 blocks of residential street that led back toward the east side of Black Ridge, where Maisie Rowan lived with whatever remained of her particular domestic situation. An old woman was sweeping her porch 2 houses down. She watched him without subtlety. He kept walking. He stopped at the corner of Creston Road and looked at the house numbers until he found the one that matched what the town records would have told him if he'd looked them up, which he hadn't needed to because he'd asked Carla Vess, and Carla Vess knew everything. The Mercer house was a small craftsman bungalow with a ramp over the front steps, clearly added after the fact, the wood not quite matching the original porch boards. The ramp was solid. He could see that from the sidewalk. Someone had built it right. There was a light on in the front window, the faint smell of coffee and the cold air. He stood there for a moment. Then he went back to the shop. By noon, the messages had started coming in. Confirmations, in the specific shorthand that people who didn't like putting things in writing used. Numbers, times, the single word in, or confirmed, or sometimes just a thumbs up from someone who found even that level of communication sufficient. By 2 o'clock, he had counts from 7 chapters and 4 independent groups. By 4 o'clock, he was fielding calls from writers in 3 states who'd gotten the word through channels he hadn't even activated, word spreading through the regional network the way information spreads in any close community, at the speed of shared values recognizing each other. He called Silas at 4:30. "How many?" Silas said. Gideon looked at the number he'd been keeping on a notepad. "Somewhere between 200 and 250, still coming in." The silence on the other end of the line was the particular silence of a man who was not surprised but was allowing himself a moment with the information anyway. "Tonight," Silas said. "Tonight," Gideon agreed. "You told Mercer?" "No." A pause. Should he know? Gideon thought about this, about the field jacket and the flat eyes and the particular dignity of a man who had learned to carry himself through the world as if none of it could touch him anymore, and the way that dignity was both real and also cost him something every single day to maintain. "No," Gideon said. "He'll know when it happens." Maisie Rowan came through the park at her usual time, backpack heavy on the left shoulder, ponytail half fallen, red coat buttoned all the way up against the sharpening cold. She stopped when she saw Gideon sitting on the south bench. He'd chosen the south bench deliberately. She looked at him for a moment. Then she came and sat at the far end of the same bench, leaving a careful, precise 3 feet of space between them, which Gideon respected by not acknowledging. "You were here yesterday," she said. "I was." "You're a mechanic." She said it the way children state facts they've confirmed, as both information and test. "Cross-mechanical, Route 9. She absorbed this. She unzipped her coat slightly and retrieved the red notebook and opened it to a page near the front. And Gideon caught a glimpse of handwriting in 2 columns, dense and careful for a 9-year-old, but didn't look closely enough to read it. "Were you in the Army?" she asked. "Yes." "Like Mr. Mercer?" "Like Mr. Mercer." He paused. "Different branch. He was a Marine." "What's the difference?" It was a genuine question, offered without any implication, and he answered it the same way. Briefly, factually, the way you answer a child who wants information rather than validation. She listened carefully, her pen hovering over the notebook, and when he was done, she wrote something small and went quiet again. "He comes here a lot," she said. "Mr. Mercer. I see him when I walk through. He feeds the ducks." "I know." A pause. "Sometimes he's here when it rains. He doesn't use an umbrella." Gideon looked at the pond. "Some people don't mind rain." "I think he minds," she said, with a certainty that surprised him. "I think he just doesn't want to go home yet." He looked at her. She looked at her notebook and wrote something else. "What are you writing?" he asked. She turned the notebook slightly so he could see the top of the page, where 2 words were written in large, careful letters as a header. "Important things." "It's my list," she said. "Of what?" "Things I want to remember, things I want to do." She paused. "Things that matter." He thought about that. He thought about a 9-year-old keeping a list of things that matter in a red notebook inside a red coat, written in the careful handwriting of someone who understands that certain things need to be set down before they escape. "Yesterday was on the list?" he asked. She turned a few pages back and showed him a line. Stand up for someone. He looked at it for a moment. He didn't say anything. I crossed it off, she said. She showed him the line through it, neat and deliberate. But then I added another one. She turned to the current page and showed him the newest entry at the bottom of the column. Never stop showing up. He read it twice. That's a good one, he said. She closed the notebook with the gravity of someone replacing something valuable. Are you going to come back tomorrow? He thought about what was going to happen tonight, the road from here to there, the 250 motorcycles, and the cold air, and the amber streetlights, and Elias Mercer's face. I'll be around, he said. She nodded once, the same formal nod as yesterday, and stood and settled her backpack and walked toward the south exit. At the path's edge, she stopped and turned back. Why did you sit beside him? She asked. Not in front. Beside. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Because he was already doing the hard thing, he said. I just didn't want him to do it alone. She looked at him with those steady, measuring eyes. Then she turned and walked out of the park, her red coat disappearing around the bend in the path, and Gideon sat on the bench in the thickening cold as the afternoon gave up its light by degrees, and the ducks moved in their quiet circles on the gray water. And somewhere across town, Elias Mercer was probably sitting in his house on Creston Road, not looking out the window at the ramp that didn't quite match the porch boards. He pulled out his phone and sent one word to Silas. Ready. Then he sat for another minute, alone in the cold, with the sound of the wind and the brittle leaves and the distant murmur of traffic on Route 9, and the weight of tomorrow and the weight of yesterday, and the particular heaviness of carrying things that didn't belong to you, but that nobody else was carrying, which was sometimes the only way to make sure they got carried at all. He didn't notice the black SUV parked at the north entrance of the park until it pulled out, too fast, too deliberate, and he caught just a glimpse through the windshield of the boy from yesterday, the tall one, and beside him an older man with the particular set of jaw and eye that said the boy had come home and told a story, and the story had been received by someone with a longer reach and a shorter patience. The SUV turned north on Millhaven Street and disappeared. Gideon stayed very still. He looked at the empty street. He looked at the south path where Maisie Rowan had walked. Then he picked up his phone and called Silas back. Move it up, he said, his voice flat and cold as the water behind him. We do it tonight. And Silas, tell them to come quiet. No announcements, no warning. A pause, the weight of it settling between them across the line. Someone else was watching. The SUV's taillights were two red smears dissolving into the dark at the end of Millhaven Street, and Gideon Cross stood beside his bike in the park's north lot with his phone still warm against his ear and the cold working its way through every seam in his jacket. Silas hadn't said anything yet. That was how Gideon knew he'd understood. How old? Silas said finally. The man in the car, 40s, hard 40s, the kind that comes from doing something the wrong way for too long. Gideon watched the empty street. I've seen that jaw before. That's not a father coming to check on his kid. That's someone who's already decided the situation requires management. You get plates. Partial. Tennessee. Starts with 7 Baker. He heard Silas set something down on the kitchen counter. That same metal-on-wood sound. The Dutch oven probably still on the stove. Dinner going cold. A brief silence in which Gideon could almost hear the older man's mind working through the geometry of it. How long before tonight's convoy rolls? Silas asked. We said 9. I can push it to 8:30. Push it. Another pause. And Gideon, the girl. I know. You know isn't good enough right now. Gideon exhaled, watched his breath disappear into the dark. I'll check her route. Make sure she got home. He hung up and stood for another moment in the parking lot, alone with the sound of leaves skittering across asphalt in the wind. The park behind him was empty. The pond he couldn't see but could feel. That cold, flat presence, all that still water in the dark. He thought about the SUV sitting at the north entrance and how long it might have been there before he noticed it. Thought about the angle from the driver's seat to the south bench where he and Maisie had been sitting 20 minutes ago. Thought about what someone with a longer reach and a shorter patience would do when they discovered that the inconvenient old man in the wheelchair now had an inconvenient friend with a Harley-Davidson and apparently some kind of reach of his own. He got on the bike. He didn't go back to the shop. Elm Street dead-ended at a chain-link fence at the back of a vacant lot. And 2 houses before the fence, there was a small yellow rental with a light on in the kitchen window and a bicycle with a bent front wheel locked to the porch railing. Gideon coasted past without stopping, saw the shadow of someone moving behind the kitchen curtain. Adult height, too tall to be Maisie. He went around the block and came back, slower this time, and parked at the corner under a streetlight that was doing its best against the dark, with about 60% success. He waited. The kitchen light stayed on. After about 4 minutes, another light came on upstairs. Small window, probably a bedroom. He waited another 5 minutes. The downstairs light went off. He sat with the engine off and the cold pressing in, and the street perfectly quiet except for a dog somewhere on the next block and the sound of his own breathing. She was home. He started the bike and rode toward Route 9 and thought about the bent wheel on the bicycle and what that meant about available transportation on a teacher's salary, and thought about a lot of other things he didn't have the right or the information to draw conclusions about yet, and filed them alongside everything else in that cabinet, marked requires further examination. The Iron Covenant chapter house was already loud by the time he arrived at 7:15. Loud in the specific way of a gathering rather than a party, the sound of multiple engines in the lot, voices on the porch, the back and forth of men who hadn't seen each other in months falling rapidly back into the rhythm of shared language. Bikes lined the gravel drive 3 rows deep, and more coming in from the road in pairs, their headlights sweeping across the dark tree line as they turned in. Gideon stood at the edge of the porch and counted instinctively, the way he counted anything that arrived in numbers. Not obsessively, just as a base-level orientation. He got to 60 before he stopped counting and started looking at faces instead. He didn't know all of them. The Iron Falls chapter had brought people he'd met once or twice at regional gatherings, big men with quiet faces, and the particular watchfulness of people who'd learned early that attention was a survival skill. The Meridian chapter ran younger on average, late 30s, early 40s, a tighter build with more recent ink and a different kind of stillness, less weathered but no less deliberate. There were independents too, men and women who rode alone or in pairs and affiliated loosely with different chapters depending on geography and need, and who showed up to things like this because the network that sustained them depended on showing up when it counted. And then there were the ones Gideon hadn't expected. He saw the first veteran patch from 20 feet away. A different chapter entirely, red and black. A chapter out of Rutherford County called the Stone River Riders that had started, Gideon happened to know, as a motorcycle group specifically organized around Vietnam-era vets and their families. He'd heard of them. He didn't know them personally. He counted 4 Stone River patches in the first pass. Then 6. Then he stopped counting patches and looked for Silas. Silas was in the garage, which had been cleared to serve as a staging area, its overhead fluorescence casting everything in the flat, honest light that made no allowances for shadows or softening. He was talking to a woman Gideon didn't recognize, small, maybe 60, short gray hair, a cut that identified her as a road captain from a chapter he couldn't immediately place. She was talking, and Silas was listening with the same quality of attention he gave everything, which was total, and which made the person receiving it feel briefly like the most important variable in whatever equation he was currently solving. He noticed Gideon and raised a hand, the woman mid-sentence. Gideon waited. He didn't interrupt Silas in conversation. That was a rule he'd developed not from instruction, but from 11 years of observation, and from the understanding that the particular quality of Silas Boone's attention was a finite resource, and interrupting it was a form of waste. When the woman finished, Silas crossed the garage. "Stone River chapter," Gideon said before he could speak. "Called me at 5, Silas said. "They have 12 members, 8 of them Vietnam vets." A pause. "Apparently word travels." "Apparently." "The woman you saw me talking to, Ruth Calhoun, road captain, Meridian Women's Chapter. She brought 11. Silas looked at the garage entrance where another knot of riders was coming in from the lot. "We're at 2:30 confirmed, still getting stragglers." Gideon looked at his president. He'd known this man long enough to read the frequencies that didn't reach his face, and what he was reading now was something Silas rarely allowed himself. A particular stillness that wasn't tactical, that didn't come from calculation. He'd seen it once before, At the funeral of a chapter member 4 years ago, standing at the back of a church, Gideon had waited outside. "You okay?" Gideon asked. Silas looked at him evenly. "I'm fine." "Silas?" A brief silence. The fluorescents hummed. Outside, another engine cut out and boots hit gravel. "My uncle served in Vietnam," Silas said. "He came home in '69. He died in 2002, and I don't think he had a single year between those two dates where he was entirely in the room with people." He looked at the garage entrance again. Nobody ever did this for him. He said it flat and clean, without asking for anything, the way you state a fact that cost you something to admit. Gideon didn't say anything. That was the right response. The plan was simple, which was how Silas built everything. 230 riders would stage at the Route 9 industrial lot at 8:15. At 8:45, they'd roll as a convoy through Millhaven Street, past the park, along Creston Road. No announcements, no advance notice. No contact with Elias Mercer or his household before arrival. They'd stop in front of the house and they'd stay for as long as they stayed. No rhetoric, Silas said, standing in the garage with most of the chapter around him and the Meridian and Iron Falls riders filling in the edges. No speeches, no yelling. We show up. That's what we're there for. He looked around the room. If anyone has a problem with quiet, leave now. Nobody left. Gideon moved through the gathering after the briefing, checking in with chapter members, exchanging the brief, precise conversations that were the chapter's native register. He talked to Dale Whitmore from Iron Falls, who was 58 and rode with the specific loose-shouldered ease of someone who'd been on a motorcycle longer than he'd been off one. He talked to Marcus Webb, who'd brought 7 riders from the Southern County group and who said very little but whose face said that whatever Gideon needed from him was already decided and available. He talked to a man he didn't know whose name turned out to be Harlan Birch. Stone River Riders, 67 years old, a Vietnam vet himself who'd gotten the word from someone who'd gotten it from someone and had driven 3 hours that afternoon. Harlan Birch shook Gideon's hand once, firmly, said, "First Cavalry, 69, and then went back to his coffee. Gideon stood near the workbench at the back of the garage and watched it all. The gathering, the low voices, the leather and the chrome, and the cold air moving through the open doors, and felt the thing he always felt when the chapter assembled for something that mattered, which was not pride exactly, but something more foundational, less named, the feeling that certain things in the world actually held. He was still standing there when Danny Reese found him. Danny Reese was 29 years old and had been a full member of the Iron Covenant for 14 months, which was long enough to have learned the rhythms of the chapter, but not quite long enough to have earned the particular ease that came with the longer members. He was lean and quick-moving, with a mechanic's hands, and a face that held more intelligence than he usually bothered to display. And he was the member who'd flagged the property fraud case against the elderly couple on Beaumont Street 8 months ago that had resulted in 2 arrests and a significant settlement, a fact that the chapter knew about, but that Danny had never brought up again, which was the correct response, and which had improved Gideon's opinion of him considerably. He came to Gideon's corner of the garage without the usual social preamble, and Gideon registered that immediately. "What?" Gideon said. Danny looked at him. He had something in his hand, his phone, turned toward Gideon, showing a Facebook post. Gideon looked at it without touching the phone, the way you look at something that might be relevant to a situation you haven't fully mapped yet. The post was from a profile with a Caldwell County location. A man in his mid-40s, heavy-set, with a jaw Gideon recognized from the passenger seat of a black SUV less than 3 hours ago. The post was brief, public, 2 hours old. Some people need reminding that Blackridge isn't their town. 46 reactions, 17 comments. The comments were what they were. The chorus of agreement from people who'd never needed a reason that cost them anything. Gideon looked at Danny. "His name is Warren Cull," Danny said. "He owns 3 properties in Caldwell County and 2 in the Blackridge Township limits. The boys from the park, the tall one is his nephew. The others are kids from his neighborhood." He paused. "He's got a DUI from 2019 and a dismissed assault charge from 2021. The dismissal was because the witness recanted." Gideon stared at him. How do you know all this already? I looked. Danny said it simply. When you called Silas, Silas called the chapter. I started looking. A silence in which Gideon revised his opinion of Danny Reese upward again. The properties he owns in Blackridge Township, Gideon said. One's a rental on Hamilton Street. One's a vacant lot on the corner of... He stopped. His voice changed slightly. It's on the corner of Creston Road and 4th. The air between them went very still. Say that again, Gideon said. Corner of Creston and 4th. Danny held the phone steadier. County records show he purchased it 14 months ago, currently listed as undeveloped commercial property. He filed for a variance to build a... That's a block from Mercer's house, Gideon said. Danny said nothing. Gideon looked at the garage entrance where the riders were still coming in, the sound of engines and boots on gravel and voices in the cold night air, and he felt the shape of something changing under his hands. The way a machine you think you understand begins to reveal a different configuration than the one you'd diagnosed. This wasn't about 4 teenage boys being aggressive in a park. This was about something with a longer history and a more deliberate architecture than that. He took Danny by the sleeve. Silas needs to hear this, he said. Right now. Silas listened to Danny the way he'd listened to Gideon earlier. Completely still, hands flat on the workbench now, eyes on Danny's face. When Danny finished, Silas asked 2 questions. When did Cole file the variance? And was there any record of prior contact between Cole and the Mercer property? Danny answered the first, 11 months ago, and said he needed more time for the second. Get more time, Silas said. Danny left. Silas looked at Gideon. What do you think he wants with the lot? Silas asked. Access or pressure, Gideon said. Build something adjacent that drives the property value down, or buy the Mercer house cheap when they can't maintain it, and he's made living there uncomfortable enough to sell. He paused. Either way, the presence in the park isn't random, and the boys weren't there by accident. Silas was quiet for a moment. The nephew. Teenagers make useful instruments when you want something done at arm's length. He sent a 72-year-old veteran's park visits as the scene. He probably expected it to work once or twice, and that would be enough. Uncomfortable enough to stay home. Once he stays home, the wife starts wondering about the neighborhood. You know how this goes. Silas knew how it went. He'd seen it before, in different configurations, in different towns. The slow, deliberate erosion of a person's ability to feel safe in the spaces they'd occupied for decades, executed with the patient confidence of someone who understood that most people don't connect the incidents until after they've already made the decision the other person wanted them to make. We still go tonight, Silas said. We still go tonight, Gideon agreed. But this doesn't end tonight. Silas looked at him with an expression that said he'd already known that from the first phone call and had chosen to begin anyway, which was the only kind of beginning available and the only kind worth making. It was cold at the Route 9 industrial lot in a way that had an opinion about it. Aggressive, continental, the air off the plateau cutting right through leather and denim and good intentions alike. 231 motorcycles staged in rows across the old concrete apron, headlights off, engines running or recently stilled, their collective warmth mixing with exhaust into a low fog that sat at chest height and glowed faintly under the lot's 2 functioning floods. Gideon had been to large chapter gatherings before. He'd been to regional rallies where the head count hit 4 figures. He'd participated in convoy rides that covered 3 states. But there was something about this particular gathering, its quiet, its specificity, its complete absence of the performance that usually attended large biker assemblies, that sat differently in the chest. Nobody was showing off. That was the thing. 231 people in the cold on a Wednesday night in October, and there was no posturing, no theater, no display. Men and women sat on their bikes or stood beside them in the fog and smoked or drank from thermoses and talked in low voices and waited. And what they were waiting for had nothing to do with themselves and everything to do with a man they didn't know who'd come home from a war 54 years ago and who still went to the park on Tuesdays and Thursdays to feed the ducks. At 8:30, Gideon put his headset in and said, "Silas, you ready?" "Ready," Silas said from somewhere in the middle of the formation. "Harlan." He looked for the Stone River captain. Harlan Birch was near the front, sitting on a dark blue Road King that had been ridden hard for a long time and cared for with equal dedication. He looked at Gideon with the patient eyes of a man who had waited for far more consequential things than this. "Whenever you say," Harlan said. Gideon looked at the lot, at the fog, and the riders, and the cold night above them. "Rolling in 5, he said. They came through Blackridge the way thunder comes, not all at once, but progressively, sound arriving before sight, the deep rolling note of 200 engines building from the south and traveling north through streets that had gone quiet with evening and ordinary life, and people who had no reason to expect what was coming. Porch lights came on. Curtain edges shifted. On Millhaven Street, a man stepped off his front porch and stood on his lawn and watched the convoy pass and took off his hat, without appearing to realize he'd done it. The riders kept their lights on and their voices off. No horns, no revving, just the sustained, deliberate thunder of their passage block by block through the small town, and the amber streetlights catching chrome and leather and faces that looked straight ahead with the quiet resolve of people who'd decided something and weren't having second thoughts about it. Gideon rode at point. He felt it in his chest, the vibration of the road through the handlebars, through the grips, up his arms, and into the place just below the sternum where he'd once been told during a VA appointment that he carried his stress, which he'd received as information without knowing what to do with it. He felt the cold on his face and the smell of exhaust and the sound of everything behind him, and he looked at Creston Road coming up on the left and thought about a man who hadn't wanted to go home yet and who'd sat in the cold for 2 hours without complaint, while a nephew with a loose relationship with commitment went somewhere warm. He turned left on Creston. The convoy followed. What? The Mercer house had one light on in the front room, the same light Gideon had seen that morning, and the porch ramp gleamed slightly in the street light, and the night was very quiet on this block, just residential stillness, and the sound of a dog somewhere, and then, from the south, the sound of engines. He pulled to the curb across from the house and stopped. The riders came in behind him and spread, filling both sides of the block, parking in the practiced way of people who'd moved in formation before, each bike settling into position with a quiet precision that had not been rehearsed because it didn't need to be. The engines went quiet one by one, a diminuendo that lasted almost 2 full minutes as the last of the convoy rolled in and found its place. And then Creston Road was silent. 231 motorcycles lined the block, their riders sitting still or standing beside them, all of them facing the house with the ramp and the light in the front window, and nobody said a word. Gideon waited. The curtain in the front window moved, then the porch light came on. Then, after a long moment, the front door opened. Steck. Elias Mercer appeared in the doorway in his wheelchair, dressed in the same clothes he'd been wearing in the park. Field jacket, name tape, the Vietnam veteran's cap tilted at the angle he apparently favored for public appearances. He sat in the doorway for a long moment, looking out at the block, his face doing a thing that Gideon couldn't read from across the street. Vivian appeared behind him, small, white-haired, one hand on the doorframe, the other reaching down to touch her husband's shoulder. Gideon saw Elias's hand come up and cover hers without him looking back to find it. Silas had come to stand beside Gideon. He was very still. He had his arms at his sides. The silence stretched. Then, from the porch, Elias said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air, not loud, just direct, "Who's in charge of this?" Gideon stepped forward into the streetlight. Elias looked at him. Recognition crossed his face, followed by something more complicated. "Cross," he said. "Mr. Mercer." Elias looked at the street, looked at the rows of bikes and the riders and the cold night and all the chrome under the amber light. He looked for a long time. "How many?" he said finally. 231, Gideon said. Elias absorbed this. He looked down at his hands in his lap. His jaw moved once, not in speech, just in the compression of something that needed containing. Silas stepped forward. He came to the foot of the porch ramp and stopped. And he stood there, this large, quiet man in his leather, cut with his hands at his sides, and then with the complete absence of theater, he raised his right hand in a military salute. Not performed, not presented. Given. The way you give something that costs you, freely, because the person receiving it has already paid for it in full. The sound that followed was the sound of 230 riders doing the same, a soft, unified rustling, and then silence, and 230 hands held. Gideon raised his. Elias Mercer sat in his wheelchair on his porch on Creston Road and looked at the street and all of them looking back at him, and his right hand came up slowly and returned the salute, and his face was doing the thing faces do when they've run out of the particular architecture that keeps certain things inside. And from the doorway behind him, Vivian's hand tightened on his shoulder. From the south end of the block, unnoticed by anyone except Gideon, because he was the only one looking in that direction, a small figure in a red coat stood at the corner of Creston and 4th. Maisie Rowan. She must have heard the convoy from her house 2 blocks away, must have followed the sound the way children follow things that announce themselves as significant. And she stood at the corner with her hands deep in her coat pockets and her face turned toward the house with the ramp and the porch light, watching. Gideon thought about the corner lot on Creston and 4th that Warren Cole had purchased 14 months ago, the lot Maisie Rowan was currently standing on. He thought about the Facebook post. Some people need reminding that Black Ridge isn't their town. He thought about the black SUV at the north entrance of the park with its clear sight line to the south bench, and he thought about the boys who'd been in that park before, more than once apparently, and he thought about a girl who walked through that park every day after school with a heavy backpack and a bent bicycle on her porch. He pulled out his phone slowly, keeping his salute arm raised, and with the other hand typed a message to Danny Reese. Maisie Rowan's mother. Find out what she's dealing with. Now. Danny's response came back in 40 seconds. Already found it. You need to see this. Not here. Call me when you're clear. Gideon looked at the message. He looked at the house and Elias and the salute still held. He looked at the corner where Maisie stood. He lowered his saluting hand slowly and felt the cold air on his palm. The shape under his hands had changed again, and this time it was bigger than he'd thought, and it had more angles. And one of those angles pointed directly at a 9-year-old girl in an oversized red coat who kept a list of important things in a red notebook and had stood in front of 4 boys and hadn't moved. And he understood now, with the specific clarity of a man who'd spent years learning to read terrain for hidden structures, that what he'd thought was one situation was actually 2 situations that had been running on adjacent tracks, and that the tracks converged at a point he hadn't reached yet. He stood on Creston Road in the cold, and the noise of 200 engines restarting around him as the convoy began its quiet dispersal, and he looked at the empty corner where Maisie Rowan had been standing, because she was already gone, had turned back toward home in the dark, her red coat swallowed by the night, and the lot at Creston and 4th was just a vacant rectangle of dead grass and chain link, ordinary and unremarkable, and full of something he hadn't uncovered yet. His phone buzzed again. Danny. Her mother's name is Claire Rowan. She's fighting a custody case. The other party is represented by a law firm out of Caldwell County. Gideon stared at the screen. The firm's primary client for property development in this township is a man named Warren Cole. The convoy was breaking up around him, engines pulling away into the dark, taillights stretching red down Creston Road in both directions. Silas appeared at his elbow and looked at the phone in Gideon's hand and said nothing, waiting, because he could read Gideon's face in the same way Gideon could read his, and what he was reading required no verbal translation. Claire Rowan is Maisie's mother, Gideon said. Silas waited. She's in a custody dispute. Her opposing counsel is from Caldwell County, from a firm that works for Warren Cole. The last engines faded. Creston Road went quiet except for the wind in the oak trees and the distant sound of Vivian Mercer's voice from inside the house, telling her husband something Gideon couldn't make out, but that had the quality of something said only in complete privacy and only after a very long wait. Silas looked at the empty lot on the corner. Then he looked at Gideon. The boys in the park, Silas said, were never about Elias. They were about the girl. Gideon looked at the corner, at the dark space where Maisie had been standing, at the empty lot that Cole had bought 14 months ago, which was, he ran the calculation without wanting to, approximately 2 months after Claire Rowan had filed for custody. They were about her mother, he said. Elias was just in the way. He paused. Or Elias was the distraction, Something that would pull attention toward him and away from whatever Cole needs to stay quiet about long enough to finish the custody case. Silas was very still. "What does a property developer need with a custody case?" he said. "I don't know yet." Gideon pocketed the phone. His voice had gone flat in the way it went when he was moving from analysis to decision. "But Claire Rowan is in a fight she doesn't know the full shape of, and her 9-year-old daughter is walking through a park every day where someone has been watching her, and the people watching her are connected to the people who are supposed to be on the other side of her mother's courtroom." He looked at Silas. "That's not a custody case," Gideon said. "That's leverage." The word dropped into the cold air between them and sat there, and the wind moved through the oak trees on Creston Road, and somewhere at the end of the block, the last taillight disappeared, and 230 people who'd come here tonight for a veteran they didn't know were riding home through the dark Tennessee night, carrying the warmth of something they'd done that was exactly what it appeared to be, clean and clear and unambiguous. While back here on this corner, in the cold, what had appeared to be one story was splitting into something uglier and more deliberate, with a child at its center and a courtroom as its arena and a man who collected property and sent teenagers into parks as its architect. Gideon started walking back to his bike. Then he stopped, because the black SUV was back. It was parked at the far end of Creston Road, past the last of the dispersed bikes, outside the ring of streetlight, dark and still. It had not been there 20 minutes ago. It had come in quietly, without lights, while everyone's attention was on the house with the ramp and the salutes and the sound of 200 engines. And it sat there now at the edge of the dark with its engine off and its occupant or occupants invisible. And Gideon understood with the cold, immediate clarity that cuts through everything else in moments that count that whoever was in that car had just watched every single moment of what had happened on this block tonight. Had watched, had counted, had noted who was here and what was organized and how quickly it had assembled and what it might be capable of. He looked at the SUV for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked away and kept walking to his bike, because the worst thing you could do right now was let them know he'd seen them. Because seen was documented, and documented changed behavior, and changed behavior altered the shape of whatever was coming, and he needed what was coming to maintain its current shape long enough for Danny Reese to finish what he was finding. He got on his bike. He started the engine. He pulled out his phone one more time and typed a message to Danny. "Claire Rowan. Whatever she's filed in that custody case, find out if there's a property component. Find out if there's something she has or knows that Cole needs to make disappear before a court date." He sent it. Then he typed a second message to a different contact, a woman named Angela Marsh, who worked for a nonprofit legal advocacy organization in Nashville and who had, on 3 previous occasions over the past 6 years, received information from Gideon Cross that had resulted in cases being reopened, amended, or entirely reconsidered. "Angela, need your eyes on something out of Blackridge, Caldwell County jurisdiction. Possible custody case being used as instrument of property coercion. Child involved. Can you call me tonight?" He sent that one too. He sat on his bike in the cold on Creston Road with the phone in his lap and the SUV at the end of the block, dark and still, and looked at the Mercer house where the porch light was still on and the front door was closed, and behind it 2 people who'd spent 40 years on this street were sitting with whatever tonight had given them and whatever it was going to cost them when morning came. His phone lit up. Angela Marsh. Not a text. A call. He answered on the first ring. "Tell me everything," she said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who has heard enough to already be moving, and he opened his mouth to begin, and the SUV at the end of the block turned on its headlights. The SUV's headlights came on like a declaration. Gideon watched them from his peripheral vision, phone against his ear, Angela Marsh's voice still running on the other end of the line. He didn't turn his head. He didn't move. He sat on the Road King with the engine idling and kept his eyes on the middle distance. The space between himself and the end of the block where the SUV sat, its lights now pushing 2 flat columns of white through the cold air. And he did the calculation. The calculation took 3 seconds. "Angela," he said, "I'm going to call you back in 20 minutes. "Gideon?" 20 minutes. He hung up. He looked left. Silas was still there, standing beside his bike at the curb. And he'd already seen the SUV because Silas saw everything that changed in a room or a street before anyone else got to it. And he was standing with that quality of absolute physical stillness that in another man might have read as paralysis. But in Silas Boone meant the opposite. It meant he had arrived at the far side of his decision and was simply waiting for the moment to move. "See him?" Gideon said quietly. "Since before the lights came on," Silas said. They let it sit for another 5 seconds. The SUV didn't move. The headlights stayed on, aimed up Creston Road, past the last dispersed bikes, and Gideon understood now that this wasn't surveillance anymore. Surveillance stayed dark. Surveillance stayed invisible. This was something else. This was announcement. This was a man letting them know he'd been watching because he'd decided that the watching had yielded enough. "We leave," Gideon said. "Normal. Don't look at him." He pulled out. Silas followed. 3 other chapter members who'd stayed back fell in behind them, and they rode north on Creston Road past the SUV at a pace that communicated nothing. And Gideon kept his eyes forward, and as he passed the driver's window, he allowed himself 1 fraction of a second to register what was there. Warren Cull. Alone this time. Phone raised, camera facing outward, pointed at the street, pointed at the bikes, pointed at Gideon's face. He rode past, his jaw set and didn't unset. They were back at the chapter house by 9:45, the garage lights still burning, the Dutch oven on the stove gone cold. Danny Reese was at the kitchen table with his laptop open and 3 printed pages beside him, and a look on his face that Gideon had learned in 14 months to associate with the specific kind of news that required sitting down to receive. Gideon didn't sit down. "Talk," he said. Danny looked at Silas. Silas gave him a nod that meant the same thing. "Claire Rowan filed for primary custody of Maisie 8 months ago," Danny said. "The respondent is her ex-husband, Kyle Rowan, who's been living in Caldwell County for the past 3 years. The custody case itself is straightforward. She has primary residency, stable employment, documented stability. The kid's in school and doing fine. On paper, Claire should win without breaking a sweat." "But," Gideon said, "but 6 months ago, Claire Rowan filed a secondary complaint through the county environmental office. She filed it under her own name because she didn't know any better and nobody told her to use a lawyer for it." Danny pushed one of the printed pages forward. "The complaint is about groundwater contamination on 3 adjacent properties in the eastern Black Ridge Township. She'd been seeing discoloration in her tap water and traced it, through her own research on her own time with whatever she could find online, to leaching from the vacant lot on Creston and 4th. The room was quiet. "Cull's lot," Silas said. "Cull's lot," Danny confirmed. "She filed the complaint 6 months ago. The county environmental office acknowledged it, assigned a case number, and then did nothing. Claire followed up twice. Both times she was told it was under review." He paused. 7 weeks after she filed the complaint, Kyle Rowan's attorney from the Caldwell County firm on Cull's payroll filed a motion in the custody case claiming Claire's residence was unsuitable due to, and I'm reading directly here, ongoing environmental and habitability concerns at the property. Gideon looked at the page. The words were there exactly as Danny had quoted them. "They took her own complaint," Gideon said, "and used it against her. They took her own complaint, let it sit unanswered long enough that the contamination would still be unresolved, and then cited it as evidence that she couldn't provide a safe home environment for her daughter." Danny closed the laptop. "The custody hearing is in 3 weeks. The fluorescent light above them hummed. Somewhere outside, the wind picked up and drove dead leaves against the garage door with a sound like scattered applause. "What's on the lot?" Silas said. It wasn't a question. "Nothing right now. Legally, it's listed as undeveloped commercial, but Cull's variance application, the one filed 11 months ago, is for a mixed-use development, 4 stories, 12 residential units, ground floor retail." Danny picked up the second printed page. "The variance was conditionally approved 8 months ago. The condition was proof of environmental clearance for the adjacent properties." Gideon understood. He understood the whole shape of it now. The way you understand a mechanism once you've found the load-bearing piece. Everything else falls into alignment around it. Cull needed environmental clearance to build. Environmental clearance required demonstrating that the contamination his lot had caused was either below threshold or remediated, which was difficult to demonstrate so long as a resident was actively on record as a complainant, which meant the complaint needed to go away, which meant the person who filed it needed to be in a sufficiently compromised position that withdrawing it, or not pursuing it further, became the pragmatic choice. Take her kid, or threaten to. He's not going to build anything, Gideon said. The development is collateral. The real asset is the clearance approval. Once he has it, he flips the lot. To who? Danny asked. Doesn't matter who. Someone who needs that clearance more than he does. Some larger developer with a bigger project that needs adjacent parcels clean. He looked at Silas. This was never about Maisie specifically. She's collateral pressure. Claire files the complaint. Claire gets pressured through the custody case. Claire pulls the complaint to protect her kid. Cole gets his clearance. And the boys in the park, Silas said. Keep Elias Mercer away from that corner. He sits in that park every Tuesday and Thursday. He sees things. He talks to people. He could have talked to Claire, Silas said. Or Maisie talks to him about the water. Or he notices the van from the lot that Danny found in 2 of Claire's complaint photographs in the county file. He stopped. He looked at Danny. The county file photographs, he said slowly. How did you get those? Danny's face changed. It was a small change. A fraction. The kind of shift that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent months reading Danny Reese in chapter meetings and garage conversations, and the particular revealing pressure of moments that required honesty. But Gideon Cross had, and he saw it. And the thing he saw was not guilt exactly, but its first cousin. The recognition that a question has arrived that was going to cost something to answer correctly. Danny, Silas said. His voice was very quiet. A silence. Danny looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked up. I had someone pull them, he said. From the county environmental database, Gideon said. Yes. That's not public access. No. Silas sat down at the table. He did it slowly, with the deliberate weight of a man who needs his body to be stationary in order to give his full attention to something difficult. He folded his hands on the table and looked at Danny. Who did you have pull them? Silas said. Another silence. Longer this time. Someone I shouldn't have gone to, Danny said. The fluorescent light hummed. Outside the wind hit the garage door again. Gideon felt the cold from the concrete floor coming up through his boots, and he stood very still while the sensation in his chest, not panic, not quite, something older and colder than panic, settled into a recognition he didn't want. How long? Gideon said. How long what? How long have you been pulling things for him? Danny's jaw tightened. That's not what this is. Then tell me what it is, Gideon said, and do it like you're talking to someone who needs to trust you in approximately the next 48 hours. Another silence, this one with a different quality, the quality of a man deciding whether the version of himself on the other side of an admission was a version he could inhabit. Danny Reese pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed out through his nose. 3 months ago, a man came to the shop, he said. Not my shop. The garage where I used to work in Caldwell County, before I moved here. He knew things about me, about a job I'd done in 2019 before I patched in, before any of this. I moved product for someone I shouldn't have moved it for, and I thought it was buried, and he had documentation that said otherwise. A pause. His name is Cull. The name landed in the room like something heavy dropped on concrete. Gideon looked at Silas. Silas was looking at Danny with his hands still folded and his face holding a very specific expression. Not rage. Nothing as uncomplicated as rage. Something that required more engineering than that. The expression of a man who has built something carefully and is watching a crack appear in the foundation and is in the process of deciding whether what surrounds the crack is still standing. What did he ask for? Silas said. Access, Danny said. He knew I'd patched in. He wanted information on the chapter, meeting times, membership, capacity. He looked up. I gave him nothing. I gave him nothing about the chapter. I want you to know that. But you went to his contact to pull county files tonight, Gideon said. I went to the contact because I needed the files, and I was trying to help, and I didn't think you handed him a record of what you were looking at. Gideon's voice was flat. You handed him a map of how much we know. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Danny put his face in his hands, not dramatically. The quiet collapse of someone who has run the calculation and arrived at a number they don't know how to carry. He knows we know, Silas said to Gideon. The SUV wasn't there to watch the convoy, Gideon said. He was there because Danny's contact called him the moment Danny pulled those files. He came to confirm who he was dealing with. He paused. He got his confirmation, and he got our faces on camera. Silas unfolded his hands, placed them flat on the table, rose. He walked to the garage door and put one hand on it, not opening it, just standing there with his back to the room, and the fluorescent light fell across his shoulders and the cut on his back. And he stayed like that for 30 seconds, with the sound of the wind outside and the hum of the light, and Danny Reese's breathing the only sounds in the kitchen. Then he turned back. "Here's what we're not going to do," Silas said, and his voice had the quality it only acquired in moments like this. Not louder, but denser, like something compressed under high pressure. "We're not going to fall apart. We're not going to have a conversation about Danny that belongs in a different room at a different time when this is resolved." He looked at Danny. "You're still in this room tonight because you found what you found and because I need what you know. But we are going to talk. You understand me?" Danny looked up. His face was stripped of its usual compression, raw in the overhead light. "Yes." "Good." Silas looked at Gideon. "What does Cole do now?" Gideon moved to the table. He picked up the printed pages, looked at them without really reading them, set them down. His mind was running fast through the architecture of the situation and landing on the pressure points. "He accelerates the custody case," Gideon said. "He can't afford to let Claire Rowan have 3 weeks to find legal support that isn't local. He'll move for an emergency hearing, claim some deterioration of the home environment, get a temporary order. Once he has a temporary custody order, Claire's compromised enough that she'll pull the complaint to get Maisie back, and by the time anyone looks at the underlying connection, it's too late. The clearance goes through and the lot transfers." "How fast can he move?" "He's already moving." Gideon looked at his phone. The moment that camera went up on Creston Road, he started documenting. Tonight's convoy doesn't look like support from the outside. It looks like a gathering of potentially dangerous individuals at a private residence. His attorney files a motion tomorrow morning, citing tonight as evidence of an unsafe neighborhood environment. Silas looked at him. "Tonight helped Elias," Silas said, "and handed Cull a weapon against Claire." The sentence sat between them with all its weight. 231 motorcycles, the cold and the chrome and the salutes, and Vivian's hand on her husband's shoulder, and Maisie at the corner in her red coat, all of it clean and true and exactly what it had been intended to be. And it had also been a photograph in a legal filing and a paragraph in a motion that a judge in a courtroom in Caldwell County was going to read in fewer than 12 hours. Gideon's phone lit up. "Angela Marsh," he answered. "I found the case," Angela said. No preamble, no social architecture. She'd been working the 20 minutes he'd given her, and apparently she was fast. Claire Rowan versus Kyle Rowan, Caldwell County Family Court, Judge H. Brennan presiding. A pause. "Gideon, do you know who H. Brennan is?" "No." "Harold Brennan, appointed to the bench 6 years ago. His appointment was publicly supported by a civic development group out of Caldwell County called the Black Ridge Growth Initiative." Her voice was steady but had an edge in it, the edge that comes from following something to its end and not liking where it terminated. The Black Ridge Growth Initiative's primary funder, from its founding through the present, is a private LLC. Gideon was already there. "Tell me anyway," he said. "The LLC is registered in Tennessee under a filing agent. The beneficial owner per 2021 amended disclosure requirements is a man named Warren Cull." The garage was completely silent. "The judge in Claire Rowan's custody case," Gideon said, making sure the words were in their right order, "was appointed to the bench by a civic organization that is financially controlled by the man who needs the outcome of that custody case to go a specific direction." "Yes," Angela said. "How fast can you move on this?" "I need the full county environmental file, the variance application, the LLC registration, and any financial records connecting Cull to the Growth Initiative post-appointment. If I have all of that, I can file for recusal and judicial review by Thursday morning. A pause. Gideon, the contamination complaint is still active. If we can get a state environmental agency review triggered before the hearing, I'll get you everything, he said. You have 40 hours. He hung up. He looked at Silas. Silas looked at Danny. Danny was already opening the laptop. It rained before midnight. Not the soft autumn rain that turned Blackridge into something from a painting. Hard, cold, decisive rain that hit the garage roof like someone had a grievance with it, sheeting off the overhang and puddling in the ruts of the gravel drive and turning the world outside the fluorescent light into a moving gray curtain. Gideon stood in the open garage door and let it run off the overhang onto his boots and looked at the rain and thought about Maisie Rowan in her house 2 blocks from a contaminated lot, drinking water she'd been drinking for months, and about Claire Rowan who'd tried to do the right procedural thing and had the procedural thing turned into a knife. He thought about a judge who owed his bench to the man whose case he'd be ruling on, and about how many other cases in that county might have the same invisible architecture supporting them, and about how many people had sat across from Harold Brennan in that courtroom without any reason to know that the room they were in was already decided. He thought about Elias Mercer on his porch tonight, and about the salute, and about how a thing could be entirely true and entirely right, and still be capable of being picked up and used as something else. His phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from a number he didn't recognize. You don't know what you're in, Cross. Pull back now, and nobody has a problem. Keep going, and we make sure the county knows your chapter was part of a deliberate campaign of intimidation against a private citizen. See how that plays with the DA's office. He stared at the message. Then he screenshot it, forwarded it to Angela Marsh with 3 words. Evidence. Keep it. And put the phone back in his pocket. He turned back to the garage. Silas was watching him from across the concrete floor, with the rain hammering the roof between them and the fluorescent light doing its flat, honest work on both their faces. Well, Silas said, he just threatened us through a burner. Gideon walked back inside, out of the rain. Which means he's scared enough to make a mistake. Scared men do their fastest damage, Silas said. I know. Gideon stopped, looked at Silas with everything stripped back. 11 years of chapter membership and 5 of close partnership, and the particular honesty available to 2 people who have stood in enough difficult places together that performance is no longer part of the vocabulary between them. I brought this to you clean, and it turned out to have a layer we didn't see. That's on me. It's on Cull, Silas said. The layer with Danny is on Danny. Silas held his gaze. And you still brought it right. A veteran in a park, a child who didn't move. That's still what we came here for. The rest of it, he paused. The rest of it is just the world being what it is. Gideon looked at his president. There's one more thing, Danny called from the table. They turned. Danny was staring at his screen with an expression that had moved past the earlier stripped rawness into something harder and stranger. The environmental contamination on Claire Rowan's property, Danny said. I pulled the original testing data from the complaint file. He looked up. The contamination isn't from normal leaching. It's not construction runoff. It's not old industrial waste. The compound profile matches a specific category of accelerated chemical deposition. He turned the laptop so they could see the screen. Someone put it there deliberately. The rain hit the roof. The lot was clean 12 months ago, Danny continued, his voice flat with the effort of keeping it that way. Cull bought it 14 months ago. The first test showing contamination is from 11 months ago. He paused. He didn't just exploit the contamination to pressure Claire Rowan. He created it. He poisoned the ground beside a house where a 9-year-old girl has been drinking the water for nearly a year, and then he used the poison to take her mother's child. Gideon felt something go very quiet inside him. Not the tactical quiet, not the operational stillness he'd learned in Kandahar and refined across 11 years of chapter work. Something older and simpler and far less managed. The particular silence that arrives when a person encounters something so deliberately architecturally cruel that the mind requires a moment to fully inhabit the reality of it before it can decide what to do next. He looked at Silas. Silas's face had gone to the place beyond expression. "Get me everything to Angela by morning," Gideon said, his voice very low and very level. "Every file, every timestamp, the testing data, the purchase records, the LLC filings, the variance application, the custody case, all of it." He paused. "And then I need to go see Claire Rowan." "Tonight?" Danny said. "Right now." He picked up his jacket. "Because she doesn't know yet that the hearing she's been preparing for 3 weeks from now just moved to tomorrow morning, and she doesn't know why she's really losing. And she's been alone in this fight since the beginning because nobody told her the shape of what she was up against." He looked at the door, at the rain and the dark beyond it. "And Maisie comes through that park every day after school, and the man who poisoned her water has been watching her, and I am done letting things develop on their own timeline." He walked to the door. Behind him, Silas spoke once, quietly. "Gideon." He stopped. "Don't go alone," Silas said. Gideon stood in the garage doorway with the rain hitting the gravel 6 inches from his boots, and he thought about Warren Cole's camera, and Warren Cole's burner phone, and Warren Cole's judge, and about the SUV that had come back after the convoy to count faces, and about a little girl standing on a poisoned lot in her red coat, watching a street full of people salute a veteran she'd been kind to in a park. He thought about what it meant that Cole had moved this fast. The text, the SUV, the acceleration, and about what it meant about the hearing timeline, and about what might already be in motion at the courthouse, and about what a man with a judge on his payroll and a burner phone and no apparent hesitation about poisoning groundwater was capable of doing in the next 12 hours if he believed he was cornered. He turned back. "Call Ruth Calhoun," he said to Silas. "The Meridian Road Captain. Call Harlan Birch from Stone River. Tell them we're not done." He looked at the rain. "And call Angela back. Tell her we may not have 40 hours. He stepped out into the rain, and his phone rang. The screen said, "Unknown number." He answered. A voice he didn't know said 2 words, "calm as weather," and those 2 words rearranged everything he thought he understood about Warren Cole and the lot on Creston and 4th and the custody case and the contaminated water and the judge, because the voice said simply, "She's gone. She's gone." Gideon stood in the rain with the phone against his ear and the water running off his jacket and down the back of his neck and said, "Who is this?" "Carla Vess." Her voice was flat and controlled in the way that people go flat and controlled when they are managing something that would otherwise be unmanageable. "I'm at Claire Rowan's house. I came to bring her dinner. I do that sometimes. She doesn't ask, I just come. And the front door was open and Claire's car is gone and Maisie is not here." "When?" "I don't know when. The kitchen light is on. There's a plate on the counter with food on it, untouched. Cold." A pause. "Gideon, the girl's backpack is here. She wouldn't leave without her backpack." He was already moving back through the garage door. "Silas," he said, not into the phone, just into the garage, and Silas looked at his face and stood up from the table. "Stay in the house," Gideon said to Carla. "Don't touch anything. Don't call the police yet." He hesitated 1 beat. "Actually, call them. Call them right now. Tell them exactly what you told me. Gideon, call them. I need it documented." He hung up. He gave Silas the information in 30 seconds. Silas received it without interruption and then stood for exactly 3 seconds in the particular stillness that preceded his decisions, and Gideon watched him and waited. "Danny," Silas said. Danny looked up from the laptop. "Can you find where Cole's vehicles are registered? Home address? Secondary properties? Anywhere he might take someone he needed out of the way fast?" Danny was already typing. "Give me 4 minutes." "You have 2. Silas looked at Gideon. "Call Angela. Tell her the timeline just became tonight." Gideon called Angela while Silas moved through the garage with the quiet, purposeful efficiency of a large man who has decided exactly what he is doing and is simply executing. He picked up his phone from the workbench. He called 2 numbers back to back, short calls, and Gideon could hear from the cadence that he was giving the same information he'd just received. Compressed, directional, actionable. He was calling Ruth Calhoun and Harlan Birch. He was calling them back. Angela answered. "The child is missing," Gideon said. 9 years old. I think Cole or someone connected to him has her and her mother. I need the recusal filing in front of a federal magistrate, not county. I need it tonight. A silence on Angela's end that lasted about 1 second and contained, Gideon estimated, a significant internal reorganization of everything she'd planned to do in the next 12 hours. Federal requires a civil rights angle, she said. Judge on the payroll of a party in his courtroom. That's a 14th Amendment due process violation. I need the LLC documentation. Danny's sending it in the next 2 minutes. I need the contamination data with timestamps. Sending. Gideon, if I file this tonight, I'm filing blind on some of it. If anything in the documents doesn't hold up, it holds up, file it. He hung up and looked at Danny. Cole's home address is a property on Ridgeline Road, Caldwell County, Danny said without looking up. 6.2 acres, main house, a secondary structure listed as a guest house, and a barn conversion. He's got a commercial storage unit on Route 7 in his LLC's name and a... Wait. His fingers stopped. He stared at the screen. He has a third property. Not in his name. In the LLC's name, registered 18 months ago. He turned the screen. It's on Harmon Creek Road, 2 miles east of Black Ridge Township limits. That's 8 minutes from here, Silas said from across the garage. It's a cabin, Danny said. Assessed at $40,000, cash purchase. No mortgage. No utility connection in any personal name. Utilities are in the LLC. Gideon looked at Silas. A property bought in a shell company's name 18 months ago, 2 months before Claire Rowan filed her custody case, 4 months before the contamination complaint. Off the main road. No personal utility connection. The kind of property that existed, in Gideon's experience, for one of 2 purposes, and one of those purposes was storage. We go, Gideon said. We go, Silas said. They were 8 riders. Silas had made that call deliberately. Not the convoy, not the 200, 8 people who moved fast and quiet in the rain, with their lights cutting through the dark Tennessee County roads. Gideon rode point. Silas rode behind his left shoulder. Danny was back at the chapter house on the phone with Angela, sending files, doing the work that needed doing from a keyboard. And Gideon had looked at him once before leaving, and Danny had looked back with the face of a man who understood precisely what the next few hours would determine about his place in this chapter, and who was not making excuses about it. The rain had settled from its earlier assault into something steadier and colder, the kind of rain that doesn't hurry because it has nowhere to be. Gideon's headlight showed him wet asphalt, and the occasional glitter of water in the ruts and the dark tree lines coming in close on both sides as the roads narrowed heading east. He could feel the rear tire tracking slightly loose on the wet surface, and he adjusted his weight forward and held the line and did not think about anything except the road and the 8 minutes and the backpack on a kitchen floor in a house with a cold plate of food and an open front door. He thought about those things for exactly as long as it took to stop thinking about them. His earpiece crackled. Gideon, Ruth Calhoun's voice from somewhere behind him in the formation. She'd come back. She'd been home for 40 minutes and had turned around when Silas called and was now somewhere in this column of 8 in the rain. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line from the road, reported a welfare check at Harmon Creek Road, concerned citizen. That'll get us a deputy in 40 minutes, Gideon said. It'll get us documentation that a call was made before we arrived, Ruth said, in case anyone asks later what we were doing on a private property. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Good thinking, he said. I've done this before, she said, and the brevity of it closed the subject. Harmon Creek Road came off a county route with a rusted signpost and no lighting, a single-lane gravel track that wound downhill through heavy second-growth forest for about a quarter mile before a structure became visible through the trees. A low, dark shape with one window showing a thin line of yellow light at its edge, the kind of light that leaks around a blind pulled down against the dark. Gideon cut his engine 200 yards out. The others cut theirs, one by one, and the sound of the rain moved into the space the engines had vacated, and the road went dark except for the diffused glow of 8 headlights still burning. He held up a fist without turning around. Held it. He listened. Rain on leaves, rain on gravel. The distant sound of the creek that gave the road its name, swollen with the night's water and running fast in the dark, somewhere to the left. From the structure, Nothing. No voices, no movement. The thin line of light at the window's edge, steady and unblinking. He turned to Silas, who had walked his bike up beside him. "Cole's SUV?" Silas said quietly. Gideon looked at the structure. He could see the edge of something parked on the far side, a dark shape that might have been a vehicle, or might have been a woodpile, or might have been the dark playing tricks with shapes in the rain. He couldn't confirm from here. "Could be," he said. Silas considered. "We can't go through the door." "No." Gideon looked at the window with its line of light. "We announce. He knows we're here anyway." "You think?" "He's been ahead of this all night." Gideon handed his helmet to Harlan Birch, who had come up on his right without being asked. Someone who buys a cabin in a shell company and drives it dark doesn't sit in there in the light without someone outside. He looked at Harlan. 67 years old, Vietnam, 1st Cavalry, 3 hours drive tonight in the rain, and still here. The older man's face was unreadable in the dark, calm in the way of people who have been in worse places and came out the other side and have thus recalibrated what constitutes a threshold worth feeling fear about. "Left side," Gideon said. Harlan nodded. "Silas." "Right," Silas said. They moved. He didn't make it to the door. He was 20 feet from the structure when it opened, and the man in the doorway was not Warren Cull. He was younger, late 30s, heavy across the shoulders, with the kind of face that organizes itself around an expectation of compliance from everyone in its vicinity. He had a phone in his left hand, and he was already talking into it when he saw Gideon, and what crossed his face in the half-second before he composed it was not fear, but the particular recalibration of a man who has been left in a position by someone else and has just understood that the someone else may have underestimated the situation. He took the phone from his ear. "Private property," he said. "Where's the girl?" Gideon said. "You need to— Oh, where is she?" The man looked past Gideon at Silas on the right flank and Harlan on the left, and the other 5 riders arranged in the dark behind them, their shapes in the rain, and did the calculation that the tall teenager in the park had done 4 days ago. The same calculation, scaled up, the same variables, just with higher stakes on both sides of it. "Nobody here but me," the man said. Gideon looked at the line of yellow light in the window. "Blinds don't pull themselves," he said. A silence in the rain. Behind the man from inside the structure, a sound, small, brief. The sound of something shifting it, a foot on a wooden floor, a chair moving an inch. The sound of someone trying to be still and failing at it by the smallest possible margin, the kind of margin that wouldn't have been audible except that the night was nothing but rain and creek water, and Gideon Cross was listening with everything he had. He looked at the man in the doorway. "Get out of the way," Gideon said. "I will call whoever you're calling." Gideon's voice had gone to the place it went when there was nothing left to manage between himself and what needed to happen. "Call them. And while you're calling them, step out of this doorway and let me confirm that there is nobody in that cabin. And if there's nobody there, you can have your conversation and we'll be on our way, and you can explain the blinds to whoever you like." The man looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at Silas. Silas said nothing. He simply stood in the rain on the right side of the door with his hands at his sides, and looked at the man with the complete oceanic patience of someone who has decided to outlast whatever is happening and has the constitution for it. The man stepped aside. Claire Rowan was sitting on a wooden chair in the back room of the cabin with her wrists zip-tied to the armrests and a bruise developing along her left cheekbone and her eyes, when they found her in the light of Gideon's phone, showing the specific expression of someone who has spent the last several hours being very, very afraid and has not yet been given any reason to stop. She looked at Gideon. She looked at the leather cut. She said, in a voice scraped thin by hours of tension, "Maisie." "I don't have her yet," Gideon said, and he said it directly because she deserved directness. "Where is she?" Claire's jaw tightened. "He took her, Cull. He came to the house with Kyle and 2 other men, and he said the hearing had been moved to tomorrow morning and that he was taking Maisie tonight per a temporary order he had in his pocket. And when I tried to stop them, Kyle hit me and they—" She stopped, drew a breath. "They brought me here. I don't know where Maisie is. I don't know if she went with Kyle or—" "Who's Kyle's attorney?" Ruth Calhoun said from the doorway. She'd come in behind Gideon, quiet, and she had a multi-tool already out, working on the zip ties. "Daniels, out of Caldwell County." "Daniels have a paralegal named Hewitt?" Claire blinked. Yes. How do you—" "Because Hewitt filed the emergency motion at 8:45 tonight through the county e-filing system, and I've been watching the case docket since Gideon called me from the parking lot." Ruth got the first zip tie, moved to the second. "The temporary order is signed by Brennan. It's real, in the sense that it exists on paper. It will not survive the morning." "My daughter. We're finding her right now," Gideon said. He was already back in the doorway, phone out, calling Danny. "Danny." "Kyle Rowan. Where does he live? Where does he stay? Is there family in Caldwell County?" "On it," Danny said. No hesitation. No trace of anything but the work. Gideon stepped back out into the rain. The man from the doorway was standing to the left of the cabin entrance, still on his phone, talking quietly, and Harlan Birch was standing approximately 4 feet away from him in the rain, saying nothing at all, which was the most effective possible statement. Silas had moved around the far side of the cabin and was crouched by the dark vehicle shape, and he looked up when Gideon came out. "Cole's SUV," Silas said. "He was here." "Was." "Engine still warm." Gideon looked at the gravel drive. In the rain it was difficult, but not impossible. The gravel held impressions longer than asphalt, and there were tire marks heading back up toward the county road, fresh enough that they hadn't filled completely. He left within the last hour. His phone buzzed. Danny. "Kyle Rowan doesn't have a permanent address in Caldwell County. He's been staying with a woman named Patrice Holt at 44 Sycamore Drive, Caldwell. That's about 12 miles from your current location. But Gideon, I just pulled a credit card transaction. Tonight at 9:57, a gas station on Route 14, which is between your location and the county line." A pause. "He bought 2 bottles of water and a pack of children's gummy vitamins." Gideon closed his eyes for 1 second. He bought things for a child. Maisie was with Kyle. "Route 14 to Sycamore Drive," Danny said. "He's heading home. He's probably 15 minutes out if he left the gas station right after the purchase." "How old is the transaction?" 22 minutes. "He's there already." "Maybe. Or he stopped somewhere." "He bought vitamins," Gideon said. "He bought them because she asked for them, or because he wanted her settled. Either way, he's not trying to frighten her. He's trying to manage her, which means he's taking her somewhere he thinks is stable." He was walking back to his bike. "He's going to 44 Sycamore." 12 miles on wet county roads at the limit of what the surface would allow was 11 minutes, and Gideon rode them in a state of focus so complete that the rain and the dark and the curves became a single continuous problem he was solving in real time, his body making the micro-adjustments that 11 years of riding had made automatic, the Road King tracking through the wet with the slightly forward weight and the unwavering line. He heard Silas behind him, heard the others. 8 headlights in the rain. His phone was in his jacket pocket, and Angela Marsh was in Nashville filing documents, and Danny Reese was at the chapter house doing the work that might matter more than any of this, and he was riding 12 miles in the rain toward a house where a 9-year-old girl was sitting somewhere with the man who had been deployed as an instrument in a scheme she didn't know about and couldn't have defended against. He thought about the red notebook. Important things. He thought about her writing in it on the park bench after the boys walked away, getting it down before she lost it, and about the crossed out line and the new one added below it, and about all the things a child learns to carry when the adults around her can't quite hold the weight of what they're supposed to be holding. He turned onto Route 14. His headlight swept across the intersection, and he saw at the far end of the street a dark SUV parked at the curb, and beside it a man standing outside the passenger door with his phone raised and his attention on the group of motorcycles that had just turned onto his street in the rain at 11:30 at night. Kyle Rowan. He was shorter than Gideon had imagined him, mid-30s, with the uncertain posture of a man who has been convinced he's the protagonist of a story someone else is actually writing. He lowered his phone as Gideon stopped the Road King 20 feet from the SUV and put the kickstand down and got off. The other riders stopped behind him and cut their engines. The silence rushed back in, rain and nothing else. Gideon walked toward Kyle Rowan. "Easy," Kyle said, his voice aimed somewhere between authority and its memory. "I have a court order. I have legal custody tonight. You can't. Where is she? Gideon said. Inside, with Patrice. She's fine. Bring her out. I'm not bringing her. Kyle. Gideon stopped 5 feet from him and looked at him with the specific quality of attention he reserved for moments that required the other person to understand, with total clarity that whatever they were using as a framework for this conversation was not the framework that applied. You don't know what tonight is yet. You don't know what the people who told you to do this have done to you and to your daughter. So I'm going to say this once. Bring her out here, to me, right now, and then I'm going to tell you what you're in, and you're going to decide what kind of person you want to be at the end of it. Kyle looked at him. He looked at the leather cut, at the 7 riders behind him in the rain, at the shapes of men and women who had ridden 12 miles in the rain in the middle of the night and showed up at his address at 11:30 and stood in the street in the cold like something that had decided to be here and was not going to decide otherwise. You're threatening me, Kyle said, but his voice had lost its architecture. I'm informing you, Gideon said. Bring her out. The front door opened. Not Kyle. Gideon watched his face, and Kyle hadn't moved. The door opened from inside, and Patrice Holt appeared, a small, tired-looking woman in her 40s who had clearly heard the motorcycles and the voices and had reached a decision about it. She had Maisie beside her, one hand on the girl's shoulder, and Maisie stepped out onto the porch in her red coat with her eyes moving rapidly across the street, the bikes, the riders, the rain, until they found Gideon. He raised a hand. She stared at him. Then she looked at Kyle and looked back at Gideon and walked down the porch steps into the rain with the same feet that hadn't moved in Riverside Park 4 days ago, steady and decisive, crossing the wet grass of the front yard toward the sidewalk. Kyle moved to intercept. Maisie. Kyle! Patrice Holt's voice from the porch was quiet. Don't. He stopped. Maisie crossed the sidewalk and stopped in front of Gideon, and he crouched down to her level in the rain, water running off his jacket, and looked at her face. She was pale, and her eyes were too wide, and she had clearly been crying at some point in the last few hours. But she was looking at him with the measuring steadiness he'd come to understand was simply the way she looked at things. You okay? He said. Where's my mom? She said. She's safe. She's with my people. We're taking you to her right now. Maisie held his gaze for one more second, doing her own assessment, running her own calculation with whatever instruments a 9-year-old has available. And then she gave him the same formal nod she'd given him in the park, and he understood it as the same thing it had been the first time. Not submission, not relief, but recognition. The acknowledgement that the right person had shown up at the right time. He stood. He looked at Kyle Rowan. Your daughter has been drinking contaminated groundwater for nearly a year, he said, and he said it quietly enough that Maisie wouldn't process it fully, but loudly enough that every syllable landed where it needed to land. The contamination was placed deliberately by the man who told you to file the emergency motion tonight. The judge who signed your temporary order has a documented financial relationship with that same man. By morning, this will be in front of a federal magistrate, and every person whose name appears on the documents connected to this will be examined. He paused. Your name is on those documents, Kyle. Kyle Rowan said nothing. You have about 6 hours, Gideon said, to decide whether you're a victim of this or a participant in it. That distinction is going to matter a great deal to a federal magistrate, and it's going to matter even more to your daughter 15 years from now when she's old enough to understand the full shape of tonight. He held Kyle's gaze. Think carefully. He turned back to the bikes. Maisie walked beside him, her red coat dark with rain, her sneakers making small sounds on the wet sidewalk, and when they reached the Road King, she stopped and looked at it. I've never been on a motorcycle, she said. Tonight you will be, Gideon said. He looked at Ruth Calhoun, who was already off her bike and coming forward, and Ruth took Maisie's hand with the natural ease of someone who has held frightened children's hands before and knows how to make the holding feel like normalcy. And Gideon took out his phone and called Danny. Federal filing, he said. Angela says 40 minutes, Danny said. Make it 30. I can't make Angela. Tell her Maisie's with us, and Claire's out, and we have Kyle Rowan standing in the rain reconsidering his life choices. Tell her the window is now, not tomorrow morning. He looked at the street, at the dark and the rain, and the 11:30 quiet of a Caldwell County subdivision that had no idea what was running through it tonight. "And Danny?" "Yeah. Good work tonight. All of it." He paused, and the weight in the pause carried everything that wasn't said. "We'll talk, but good work." He hung up. He looked at Silas. Silas was looking at him with an expression that contained, very briefly and very privately, something warmer than his usual register before it closed back into the operational calm. "Where's Cull?" Silas said. "I don't know yet." "He'll know by now that the cabin went wrong." "Yes." "He'll run or he'll push harder." "Yes." "Which is he?" Gideon looked down the empty street, thought about the Facebook post, thought about the burner phone text, thought about a man who'd contaminated a child's water supply and bought a judge and sent teenagers into parks and orchestrated a custody case and a fake development scheme with the patient. Elaborate confidence of someone who had done this before, in some form, and been permitted to do it because nobody had ever assembled the whole picture in time to use it. "He'll push," Gideon said. His phone rang. Angela Marsh. He answered, and she said, "It's filed." And then she said something else, something that arrived in his ear and traveled through him like cold water, something that took the shape he'd been building in his mind all night and showed him one more angle he hadn't seen yet, one more turn in the architecture of what Warren Cull had built and what it was actually for and how deep it went. And Gideon Cross stood in the rain at 11:37 at night on a Caldwell County street with a 9-year-old girl in a red coat standing 20 feet behind him and said nothing for 3 full seconds while the information settled into its new configuration. Then he said, "Send me everything you just found. All of it. Right now." He looked at Silas. "There are other families," he said. "Claire Rowan isn't the first. Cull has done this to at least 4 other properties in 2 counties. Same pattern: contamination, complaint, custody or foreclosure pressure, withdrawal." His voice was very level. "The federal filing Angela just submitted pulled a match in the EPA's regional database. His LLC appears in 3 prior contamination complaints across a 2-county area, all of them withdrawn or unresolved." He paused. "He has been doing this for 5 years, and not one of those cases ever made it in front of a judge who wasn't already arranged." The rain came down. "Until tonight," Silas said. "Until tonight," Gideon said. From behind them, Ruth Calhoun said quietly, "Gideon." He turned. She was standing beside her bike with Maisie, and Maisie had her red notebook out, had taken it from her coat pocket in the rain on a Caldwell County street at 11:30 at night, and was writing something in it, her head bent over the page, the rain hitting the paper, her small hand moving across the lines with the deliberate care of someone getting something down before it escapes. He watched her for a moment. Then his phone lit up with a text from a number he didn't recognize, and he looked at it, and it was 2 words and a location, and the 2 words were Warren Cull's name, and the location was the Blackridge Township Courthouse. And the text had been sent 3 minutes ago, and the message beneath the name and the location read, "Emergency injunction hearing. Judge Brennan, 30 minutes. He's trying to seal the EPA records before the federal filing processes." Gideon looked at the message. He looked at Silas. "He's not running," Gideon said. He looked at the courthouse address in the text, at the timestamp, at the 30-minute window closing fast, and he felt the cold rain on the back of his neck and the specific weight of a moment that has been building through a week's worth of accumulating pressure and has arrived at the point where it either breaks through or closes over and leaves everything exactly as it was. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the Road King. He looked at Silas and Ruth and Harlan Birch and the 5 other riders standing in the rain of a street that had no idea what was passing through it. And he thought about Angela Marsh in Nashville with her filing and her documents and her 40-hour window that was now a 30-minute window. And he thought about Danny Reese at the chapter house keyboard doing the work that might save more than just the Rowans. And he thought about Elias Mercer on his porch on Creston Road tonight, saluting and being saluted. And about a small woman's hand on an old soldier's shoulder in a lighted doorway. He thought about a red notebook in the rain, never stopped showing up. "Get on your bikes," Gideon Cross said. The Blackridge Township Courthouse was a 2-story brick building on Franklin Street that had been constructed in 1961 and renovated once, poorly, in 1994. and it wore both decades on its face with the exhausted dignity of a building that had seen too many things to bother pretending otherwise. At 11:58 at night, it should have been dark and locked and empty. Instead, it had lights in 3 windows on the second floor and 2 vehicles in the side lot, a silver sedan that belonged to someone's attorney and a black SUV that did not need a plate check. Gideon pulled to the curb on Franklin Street and cut the engine. The other 7 bikes came in behind him and went quiet one by one, and the rain-soaked street absorbed the silence the way streets absorb things at midnight, completely, without comment. He looked at the building. "He can't hold an emergency hearing without a clerk," Silas said from beside him. "He can if the clerk is on the same payroll as the judge." Gideon looked at the lit windows. "He's not holding a hearing. He's signing a document and calling it a hearing. All he needs is Brennan's signature on an injunction that seals the EPA records before Angela's federal filing processes. And by morning, the records are sealed under state court order, and the federal magistrate has to fight through 6 months of procedural challenge to unseal them." He paused. 6 months is enough time for Cole to transfer the lot, kill the development variance, dissolve the LLC, and make every financial connection disappear. "And the other families," Ruth said, "stay buried." The rain came down on the street and on the courthouse roof and on 8 motorcycles parked at the curb, and somewhere in the second floor of that building, a man in a robe was deciding how much longer he could keep the lid on something that had already begun to leak through every seal he'd applied to it. Gideon got off the bike. "You can't go in there," Silas said. "Not a prohibition, a fact stated for consideration." "I know." Gideon looked at his phone. Angela had sent the filed federal documents 20 minutes ago, timestamp, case number, magistrate's clerk confirmation. He forwarded the chain to a number he'd been given 3 years ago by a woman named Deb Salter, who covered the county beat for the Black Ridge Courier, and who had, in his experience, a very efficient relationship between receiving information and deciding what to do with it. He attached one line of text. "Second floor, Franklin Street Courthouse, right now, Brennan and Cole." He sent it. Then he called Angela. "The federal filing," he said when she answered. "Is there any mechanism by which a state court injunction signed tonight could supersede it?" He heard her pause, heard papers. "If the injunction predates the federal filing's official timestamp in the system, which processes on Eastern Time at the clerk's office open of business, so technically 6 a.m., then there's a 12-hour window where a state court could argue priority jurisdiction." Another pause. "If Brennan signs tonight and Cole's attorney files it first thing, they could create a procedural conflict that ties everything up long enough to—" "I know," Gideon said. "What stops that?" "A concurrent filing in the state system tonight from a party with standing referencing the federal case number and asserting the contamination complaint as a pending federal environmental matter." A pause. "Claire Rowan has standing. She's the original complainant. If she files a motion tonight to stay any state court action affecting her complaint, citing the federal case, it creates a concurrent record that Brennan can't unilaterally override without explicitly contradicting a federal filing. Can she file it from her phone? I can prepare the document in 10 minutes and send her a link. She signs electronically. It files automatically." A pause. "Gideon, she needs to understand what she's signing." "Put it in plain language," he said. "She'll understand it." He hung up and called Ruth. Ruth was still on her bike at the curb. "Yes." "Claire," he said. "She needs her phone in 10 minutes. Can you—" "Already calling her," Ruth said. He stood in the rain on Franklin Street and watched the lit windows on the second floor and felt the night pressing in from all sides. The cold, the wet, the hour, the accumulated weight of a week that had begun with a 9-year-old girl in a park and had arrived here, at this building, at this minute, at this particular convergence of everything that had been moving underneath the surface since before any of them had known to look. His phone buzzed. Deb Salter. A text, not a call. "On my way. Keep them in there." He almost smiled. Then the side door of the courthouse opened. Mom. Warren Cull came out first, which told Gideon everything about the relationship between Cull and Brennan. That it was Cull who moved first, who came through the door ahead, who occupied the space of a man accustomed to being the front of every room he entered, the one whose comfort organized everyone else's arrangement. He was wearing a dark jacket over a collared shirt, no tie, and he had a leather portfolio under his arm and the specific expression of someone who has just done something they've been planning to do for a long time and are in the first 30 seconds of satisfaction before they remember there's still work ahead. He saw Gideon. He saw the 8 motorcycles. The satisfaction left his face the way light leaves a room when the switch is thrown, not gradually, all at once. Behind him came a smaller man in his 60s, soft around the middle, with the careful walk of someone who has spent years inhabiting authority without fully growing into it, and Gideon recognized Harold Brennan from the courthouse photo on the county website, the one where he was shaking hands with a civic development group at a ribbon-cutting ceremony 14 months ago. The attorney came last, still holding his briefcase, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw the street. Cole looked at Gideon for 3 full seconds. "You're trespassing," he said. "Public street," Gideon said. "I have a signed injunction." "Angela Marsh has a federal case number." Gideon held up his phone, the forwarded documents on the screen, timestamp visible. "Filed 41 minutes ago. Claire Rowan is filing a state concurrent motion in approximately—" He checked the time. 6 minutes. Cole's jaw moved. Brennan made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He looked at Cole, and in that look was the specific configuration of a man who has traveled a significant distance down a road with someone else driving and has just understood that the driver's map may have been inaccurate. "Harold," Cole said, not looking at him. Brennan said nothing. "Harold." Sharper now. "Warren, Brennan stopped. He looked at Gideon. He looked at the motorcycles. He looked at the rain and the midnight street and the thing that was already in motion. And whatever calculus he was running, the result appeared to require sitting down, because he put one hand on the doorframe and breathed. Headlights turned onto Franklin Street. Not motorcycles this time. A small hatchback moving too fast for the hour in the wet road, and it stopped at the curb behind the bikes, and a woman got out with a camera bag on her shoulder and a press credential on a lanyard that Gideon could read from 40 feet away. Deb Salter, Black Ridge Courier. She looked at the scene. She looked at Cole. She raised the camera. Cole's attorney stepped forward. "You cannot photograph a public street," Deb Salter said pleasantly, and shot the first frame. What happened next did not happen fast, and it did not happen cleanly, and there was nothing in it that looked the way confrontations look when they are resolved in the way people hope confrontations will resolve. It happened over the following 40 minutes in the rain on Franklin Street and in the lobby of the courthouse, and in 3 phone calls and 2 documents filed electronically from a phone in Ruth Calhoun's hand, and it happened with the grinding incremental weight of institutional machinery being forced to turn in a direction it had been engineered to resist. Brennan did not confess on the courthouse steps. He went back inside and called his own attorney, and his voice, coming through the propped side door, had the quality of a man performing a long-delayed accounting with an audience he hadn't chosen. Cole stood on the sidewalk for 11 minutes in the rain, with his portfolio under his arm and his face doing something complex and ultimately unresolvable. And then his attorney said something quietly in his ear, and they got in the silver sedan and drove away. The SUV stayed in the lot. Deb Salter shot 2 rolls and filed her first dispatch from her phone on the courthouse steps, and Gideon read the headline when it posted at 12:31 a.m. Late-night courthouse visit raises questions about Caldwell County judge, property developer. Incomplete. Thin on specifics. Enough. Angela Marsh called at 12:44. The federal magistrate's clerk has flagged the Brennan-Cole connection for priority review. There will be a status hearing Thursday morning. A pause. The state injunction Brennan signed tonight has been automatically stayed pending the federal review. It can't be filed or enforced. Another pause, and in it was the specific texture of an attorney who has been doing this work long enough to know that most nights don't end this way. The EPA regional office received an automatic notification when the federal case was filed. They're required to respond within 72 hours. Claire's complaint goes back to active status effective tonight. Gideon stood on the sidewalk in the rain and let it land. "The other families," he said. "I'll need their names. Whatever documentation Danny found on the prior complaints." A pause. "That's a longer road." "I know. But it's a road." she said. He hung up. He stood on Franklin Street at 12:47 in the morning, soaked through, with the empty courthouse behind him and the rain still coming down, and the 8 motorcycles at the curb, and Silas standing a few feet away looking at the wet street with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face doing the thing it did when it had finished with the operational calculation and arrived somewhere quieter. It's not over, Gideon said. No, Silas agreed. Cole will have attorneys by morning. Brennan will claim procedural error and try to reframe everything. The other families, Gideon, Silas looked at him. Tonight held. He was quiet. Tonight held, Silas said again, not louder, just more settled. The rest is work. We know how to work. Gideon looked at the street, at the rain, at the taillights of Deb Salter's hatchback disappearing around the corner. He breathed out slowly, and the breath made a small cloud in the cold, and the cloud dispersed, and the rain came down on the place where it had been. Yeah, he said. Mums. Carla Vess opened the Rusty Nail at 5:15 in the morning because that was when the diner on Route 9 opened, and she had learned over 11 years that certain people arrived at certain hours for certain reasons, and that the right response was coffee and warmth and the specific grace of not requiring an explanation. She had 8 bikers, 1 journalist, 1 attorney on speakerphone, and 2 people who had been through something she was only beginning to understand the edges of, and she put on 2 pots and pulled out the good mugs and turned the lights on low, the way she did for early mornings, because some hours deserved a softer treatment. Claire Rowan sat in the corner booth with Maisie asleep against her shoulder, the girl's red coat folded under her cheek as a pillow, her face in sleep stripped of the watchfulness it wore awake, and showing instead the simple, profound vulnerability of a child who has arrived somewhere safe and allowed herself to stop. Claire had a bruise along her cheekbone that had darkened through the night into something that would require documentation, and she held her coffee in both hands the way people hold things they need to be sure of, and she looked at the table with the eyes of someone doing internal accounting. She looked up when Gideon sat down across from her. He looked at the bruise. He didn't say anything about it. Angela Marsh, he said. She's going to call you at 8. She's going to walk you through what was filed tonight and what happens Thursday. She's good, and she won't let you get lost in the procedure. He paused. The contamination complaint is active again. You'll need a water test done by an independent lab. Angela has a contact. Don't use county services for it. Claire nodded. Her eyes were steady, doing the work of someone who has been managing alone for a long time and has become efficient at receiving information. My daughter, she said, is right beside you, Gideon said. No. She looked at him. How long? How long was the water? Nearly a year, he said. I won't tell you it's nothing. Get her tested. Angela's contact does that too. He held her gaze. The levels in the complaint data are in the range that's harmful over time, not acute. She's been tired? Headaches? Claire's jaw tightened. I thought it was the stress of the custody. Get her tested, Gideon said. You caught it. That's what matters. You filed the complaint when nobody told you to, nobody helped you, and you caught it. He looked at her evenly. That took something. Claire looked at her coffee. Her hands tightened on the mug and then loosened. I was just angry, she said. That's usually how it starts, he said. Maisie shifted against her mother's shoulder without waking. Her hand moved in sleep, the small fingers finding the fabric of Claire's sleeve and closing on it, and Claire looked down at her daughter and did the thing that faces do when they've been managing everything and the management goes briefly offline, just for a second, just long enough to show the full cost of the night and the week and the months before it. She pressed her lips together and looked back at the table. Gideon stood. He went to the counter and got a refill and stood there for a moment with the warmth of the diner on his face and the smell of coffee and the sound of the rain still going outside, softer now, losing its conviction as the night began its long tilt toward morning. Ruth Calhoun was at the bar with her own coffee, talking quietly with Deb Salter, the two of them in the shorthand that forms between people who have been in the same place doing adjacent work. Harlan Birch was in the booth near the door, his cut still rain-dark across the shoulders, with an expression of profound stillness that Gideon recognized as the particular piece available to someone who has done the thing they came to do and has no remaining argument with the hour. Danny Reese was at the far end of the counter, alone, with his laptop closed in front of him and a coffee untouched beside it. He was looking at the counter surface with the expression of a man doing very patient work on something interior. Gideon sat beside him, a silence that lasted a full minute. "I didn't give him anything about the chapter," Danny said. He said it to the counter. "I know," Gideon said, "but I put us at risk. What I did tonight with the county files. Put information in our hands that changed the outcome," Gideon said, and gave Cole a half-hour advantage he couldn't use. He looked at Danny's profile. "The thing that happened in 2019, the product you moved. Is it done, or is it something that can come back?" Danny was quiet. "It's done," he said. "The person I moved it for is dead. The documentation Cole had was a copy of a police report that was closed without charges. He was using it as threat, not evidence." A pause. "I should have told Silas the moment Cole approached me." "Yes," Gideon said. "I was scared," Gideon said. "I know what that looks like." Another silence. "Silas will decide what it means for your patch," Gideon said. "That's between you and him and the chapter. But tonight you did the work when it counted, and you did it right. And those two things will both be true at the same time, regardless of how the other conversation goes." He picked up his coffee. "That's all I've got on the subject." Danny nodded. Once, slowly, the nod of a man accepting terms he can't improve. At 6:15 the rain stopped. It stopped the way prolonged rains sometimes do, abruptly, as if a decision had been made somewhere above the cloud cover, and the silence after it was enormous. The street outside the diner windows went still and glittering, every surface wet and reflecting the first gray light, and the world looked the way it looks in the hour before dawn, when the dark is losing its confidence and the light hasn't yet committed. Gideon took his coffee outside. He stood on the sidewalk in front of the Rusty Nail and felt the cold air on his face, clean rinsed, and looked at Franklin Street running quiet and empty in both directions with the puddles reflecting the streetlights, and the last few leaves coming down from the oaks, slow and spiraling, the way they fall when there's no wind to rush them. He thought about the week. Not in sequence, not as a narrative, just as a set of images that arrived without order, the way memory actually works. Elias in the park with the paper bag of bread. Maisie's feet staying planted on the cold asphalt. The sound of 230 engines going quiet on Creston Road. Danny's face in the fluorescent garage light. Silas's hands flat on the kitchen table. The yellow light leaking around the blind in the cabin window. Maisie in the rain on the Caldwell County sidewalk, writing in her notebook. The notebook. He thought about what she'd been writing at that moment. On a stranger's sidewalk, rain hitting the paper, having just been taken from her home and brought 12 miles by a man who thought he was executing a plan and was actually being used as an instrument in someone else's. And he thought about the deliberateness of it, the discipline in that small bent head, the understanding that certain things need to be recorded before the moment closes around them. He heard the door open behind him. Maisie stood in the diner doorway in her red coat, sleep-wrinkled and alert, her eyes adjusting to the gray morning light. She looked at the street and then at Gideon. "It stopped raining," she said. "Just now," he said. She came and stood beside him on the sidewalk. Not close. A comfortable distance. The instinctive spacing of a child who has learned to read whether proximity is welcome. She looked up and down Franklin Street with the same evaluating attention she brought to everything. "Is it over?" she asked. He thought about how to answer that honestly to a 9-year-old. "The worst of it," he said. "There's still work. There are other people who got hurt the same way you and your mom did, and getting them what they're owed is going to take time." He paused. "But the part where Cole could keep doing it in the dark is over. He's in the light now." Maisie considered this. She put her hands in her coat pockets. "He made the water bad," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd been there. She'd heard things. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I need to get tested," she said. "My mom told me." "You do," he said. "It'll be fine, but you need to do it." She nodded, accepting this with the same economy she applied to most things. Then she took her right hand out of her pocket. She was holding the red notebook. She opened it to a page near the back and looked at it for a moment, and then turned it slightly toward him. He looked. She'd added to the list since the last time he'd seen it. In the rain on that Caldwell County sidewalk, she'd added 3 new lines, the last few letters smeared slightly where the rain had hit the paper before she'd gotten the notebook closed. He read them in the gray morning light. Find the people who don't give up. Tell them thank you. Show up for someone else. He looked at the list for a long time. That's good, he said. All 3. She closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket. From inside the diner, there was the sound of a chair moving and voices, the comfortable low sound of people in a warm room at the end of a long night, and the smell of coffee came through the open door and out into the cold morning air, and somewhere on Route 9, the first truck of the day went past with its lights still on. Maisie looked at the motorcycles parked along the curb. 8 of them, rain-darkened, their chrome gone soft in the gray light, and she looked at them the way she looked at things she was filing away. Is it always like this? She asked. What you do? Gideon thought about it. No, he said. Most of it's quieter. He paused. Most of it is just showing up before something gets worse. She absorbed this. Looked at the bikes. The old man in the park, she said. Mr. Mercer. Is he? He's fine, Gideon said. He'll be at the park Thursday. I'll be there Thursday, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the level, measuring eyes of someone who has decided something and is not inviting debate. Okay, he said. She went back inside. He stood on the sidewalk a little longer with the cold air and the smell of coffee and the gray light that was beginning, very slowly, to take on the character of something specific. Not yet sunrise, but the hour that precedes it. The hour when the darkness has committed to leaving and the light hasn't yet revealed what the day will look like. He thought about Elias. He'd go by Creston Road this morning. Not to say much, there wasn't much to say that hadn't been said on that street 2 nights ago in a language that didn't require words. Maybe he'd fix the ramp. He'd noticed the boards didn't quite match, and he was a mechanic, and the having noticed was the same as having committed in the accounting system he ran. He thought about the other families. The 4 prior complaints across 2 counties, the LLC connections, the pattern Angela had found in the EPA database. That was longer work, the kind that would take months and would require people he hadn't met yet, and resources he hadn't assembled yet, and a sustained, patient, unglamorous application of pressure through the right channels. It was the kind of work that didn't have a moment where the engines rolled through town and the chrome caught the light. It was the kind of work that happened in document review and phone calls and small incremental disclosures, and it was the most important kind, and he intended to do it. He thought about Danny Reese. He thought about what it cost a person to be found out, and what it cost to stay after being found out, and about the specific value of the second kind of courage over the first. He didn't know what Silas would decide. He knew what he hoped. He thought about the Iron Covenant and what it was, not what the world thought it was, not what the leather and the chrome and the noise suggested, but what it actually was at the load-bearing level, which was people who had decided to show up for things that the world had decided not to show up for. Not cleanly, not without complications, not without the specific weight of damaged people trying to do undamaged things, but showing up anyway, consistently, in the rain if that was what the schedule required. He thought about Silas Boone's uncle, who'd come home from Vietnam in 1969 and died in 2002 with all that time in between, and nobody had ever done for him what had been done for Elias Mercer on Creston Road. He thought about how long things wait sometimes, how patient the uncollected debts of history can be. The door opened again. Silas came out and stood beside him in the gray morning light and looked at the street. He had a coffee in each hand and he passed one to Gideon without commentary, and Gideon took it, and they stood on the sidewalk in the cold with their coffee and the sound of the waking town coming in slowly from all directions. A car on Route 9, a dog, the distant first birds doing their assessment of the morning. Travis called me last night, Silas said. Gideon looked at him. Vivian Mercer's nephew, Silas said. He saw the news piece Deb Salter filed. Called me at 2 a.m. to tell me he was going to be on time from now on. He looked at his coffee. He sounded young. He is young, Gideon said. I know. A pause. I told him to get some sleep. They stood in the quiet. You're going back to work today? Silas asked. Dennis Pratt's clutch cable. Gideon said. 3 days late. He'll survive. He called 4 times. Silas almost smiled. He'll survive. The first actual light came over the eastern tree line then. Not dramatic, not the movie version of dawn, just the gradual, honest arrival of a gray October morning in Tennessee. The sky lightening by degrees, the wet street beginning to show its colors, the chrome on the motorcycles catching the first pale glimmer. Gideon held the coffee and let it warm his hands. The war inside him was still there. It was always still there. The particular geography of a person who had been to certain places and had brought some of those places back inside him and had lived with them long enough to know they weren't leaving. The right shoulder that hurt in the cold. The 3 a.m. hour when sleep went unreliable. The specific stillness he deployed in situations that required it, that had been trained into him in places and for purposes that had nothing to do with Tennessee parks in October, and that he had repurposed because repurposing was the only honest option. The war was still there. But this morning it was carrying something other than itself. This morning it was carrying Maisie Rowan's notebook and a ramp on Creston Road that needed better boards, and 4 families in 2 counties who didn't know yet that someone had found the shape of what had been done to them and was going to spend the next several months making that shape visible to the people with the authority to act on it. This morning it was carrying the memory of 230 engines going quiet on a residential street at night, and one old soldier's hand rising to return a salute, and a small woman's hand tightening on a shoulder in a lit doorway. Gideon Cross stood in the cold morning light on Franklin Street in Black Ridge, Tennessee, and felt the weight of what he carried, and for the first time in longer than he could specifically account for, the weight felt like something other than a sentence. It felt like the cost of the work. And the work, this morning, felt like enough. Somewhere behind him through the diner window, Maisie Rowan was adding another line to her list. He didn't need to see it to know this. It was simply the kind of thing she would do, in the kind of moment this was. And the gray light kept coming, and the street kept waking, and Gideon Cross finished his coffee in the cold and turned back toward the door. This is a fictional work created entirely for artistic and entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events depicted are wholly invented and bear no resemblance to any real persons, living or deceased, any real places, or any real events.